2 hours after giving birth, I looked at my husband, expecting him to finally hold our baby. He leaned over the hospital bed, his eyes completely devoid of warmth, and whispered that he already had a son with another woman and would never acknowledge my child. I did not scream or cry. I simply smiled and told him to remember this exact moment. He had no idea what was waiting for him the next morning. I am Bethany, 33 years old. If you have ever had a toxic partner try to discard you because they thought you were weak, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe. Because over the next 30 days, I did not just take his money. I dismantled his entire wealthy family empire piece by piece. The harsh fluorescent lights of the maternity ward hummed above me, casting long shadows across the sterile room. I was completely exhausted, my body aching from hours of grueling labor, but my arms held the most perfect tiny girl. I named her Lily. I looked toward the door, waiting for my husband of 5 years to walk over and share this profound, life-changing moment. Gavin just stood there, leaning against the cold white wall. He was dressed in a pristine, tailored suit, not a single hair out of place, repeatedly checking his heavy gold watch with an expression of pure irritation. He had not once asked how I was doing during the delivery. He had not even glanced at the bassinet. Gavin finally pushed himself off the wall and walked over to my bed with slow, measured steps. I offered him a weak smile, holding Lily up slightly, giving him the chance to be a father. He did not reach for her. He kept his hands securely in his pockets and looked down at me with a coldness that froze the blood in my veins. He told me he was leaving. He said he already had a son with another woman, a woman he actually loved, and that he would never acknowledge the child I was currently holding. He spoke the words so casually, as if he were discussing a change in his weekend golf plans rather than destroying our marriage and abandoning his newborn daughter. Before I could even process the sheer cruelty of his statement, Gavin reached into his designer leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and tossed them directly onto my lap, the heavy paper landing right next to Lily. He demanded I sign the revised postnuptial agreement immediately. He told me it completely stripped me of any right to our house, our shared assets, our bank accounts, and any potential alimony. He wanted a clean break so he could go start his real life with his new family, unburdened by the mistake of our marriage. I stared at the thick stack of papers, then up at him, asking him why he thought I would ever sign something so utterly ridiculous and unfair. Gavin laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed loudly in the quiet room. He told me I was nothing but a glorified number cruncher from a miserable trailer park in Detroit. He said his elite family had done me a massive favor by letting me breathe their air and attend their exclusive country club dinners. He reminded me that the 5 years I spent living in his luxury condo were pure charity, a temporary ticket out of the gutter that had just expired. He then leaned in closer, gripping the metal rail of my hospital bed, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. He told me that his mother, Corinne, had already prepared her ruthless legal team. Corinne had always hated me, making sure I knew my working-class background was a stain on their pristine family legacy. Gavin said if I refused to sign the papers right then and there, Corinne's high-priced lawyers were standing by to file an emergency petition with the state. They were going to claim I was suffering from severe postpartum psychosis. They planned to institutionalize me against my will and have me declared entirely unfit to care for a child, ensuring I would lose Lily to the foster system while they washed their hands of us both without paying a single dime. The sheer evil of his threat hung heavily in the air. He was using my background, my physical exhaustion, and my love for my newborn baby to force me into absolute compliance. He thought he had me completely trapped in a corner. He thought I was just a naive, boring accountant who had married into old money and was now being discarded like yesterday's trash. He expected me to beg, to cry, to plead for him to stay and reconsider. He expected me to shatter under the weight of his wealthy family's power. I did not shed a single tear. I looked deeply into his arrogant eyes, took a long, steady breath, and asked him for a pen. Gavin smirked, clearly satisfied with how easily I had folded under his threats. He pulled an expensive silver pen from his jacket pocket and handed it to me, looking incredibly triumphant. I flipped past the dense legal jargon directly to the last page of the document. I signed my name with steady, deliberate strokes, completely ignoring the pain radiating through my tired body. I handed the clipboard and the pen back to him. He snatched the clipboard away, quickly checked the signature to ensure it was valid, and laughed again. He told me he was heading straight to the airport to pick up his mistress Paige and their son. He ordered me to have my bags packed and be out of his house by tomorrow morning because Paige was moving in. He turned on his heel and walked out of the hospital room without looking back. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving me alone with my baby. The moment I was alone, my demeanor changed entirely. The facade of the defeated submissive wife vanished. I gently placed Lily back into her warm bassinet, ensuring she was safe and asleep. I reached into the hidden zippered compartment of my overnight bag and pulled out a cheap, untraceable burner phone that Gavin knew absolutely nothing about. I turned it on and opened a secure messaging application. I typed a highly encrypted message to my handler at the federal agency I had been secretly working for over the last year. I typed, "The bait is signed, freeze the offshore routing." Gavin thought he had just ruined my life and secured his fortune. He had no idea that he had just fallen into my trap. He did not know that by forcing me to sign that specific document under duress, he had just legally triggered a poison pill clause I had buried in the fine print. He had just legally severed my name from his entire criminal enterprise, giving the federal government the green light to strike without freezing my innocent assets. The real game had just begun. The morning sun hit my face as the rideshare pulled up to the towering wrought iron gates of my driveway. I held Lily close to my chest. She was asleep, completely oblivious to the war her father had declared just 12 hours ago in that sterile hospital room. As the car rolled up the sweeping driveway, the serene morning was violently broken by the sound of heavy boots and breaking glass. 4 burly movers were hauling my personal belongings out the front door and tossing them onto the manicured front lawn. I watched my custom-built nursery furniture, my carefully curated professional wardrobe, and my entire home office being piled unceremoniously next to the active sprinklers. Standing on the front porch directing this chaos with absolute delight was Paige. She was wearing my monogrammed silk robe, sipping espresso from my favorite mug. I paid the driver, stepped out of the car, and walked up the driveway with Lily secured safely in my arms. Paige spotted me and let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut straight through the crisp morning air. She casually leaned against one of the massive stone pillars framing the entryway, looking entirely too comfortable in the life I had built. "Gavin said you would probably show up crying," Paige sneered, taking a slow sip of her coffee. She raised her left hand purposely, catching the sunlight on a massive 5-carat diamond ring. "He told me he made you sign absolutely everything away in the hospital. You really are pathetic. He always said you were just a number cruncher from a trailer park in Detroit. Take your trash and go back to the slums where you belong." I stopped at the base of the stairs. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply looked at the ring on her finger. As a senior forensic accountant, my brain automatically appraised the stone. Flawless clarity, custom platinum setting, easily $250,000. Purchased no doubt with embezzled funds from his wealthy family's clients. It was a beautiful, sparkling piece of hard evidence. "Are you deaf?" Paige snapped, stepping forward and waving a manicured hand at the lawn. "I said, get your garbage off my property. Gavin and I are redecorating today." I adjusted my hold on Lily and walked straight up the stone steps, completely ignoring her demands. Paige's smug expression faltered as I brushed right past her and stepped into the grand foyer of the house. "Excuse me, you cannot be in here," she yelled, trailing right behind me. "I am calling security right now." I walked directly to the central smart home command panel embedded in the hallway wall. Gavin loved showing off this state-of-the-art security system to his elite friends. He bragged endlessly about the titanium-reinforced doors and the shatterproof glass windows. He just never bothered to learn how the software actually worked. I did. I entered a 12-digit alphanumeric master override code that I had programmed months ago for a moment exactly like this. The system chirped a pleasant confirmation tone. Heavy deadbolts slammed into place across every exterior door with a synchronized, echoing thud. The electronic steel shutters slid down over the front windows, sealing the house completely. Outside, the movers dropped a box of my books, staring in utter confusion at the sudden lockdown. They were permanently locked out. Paige froze in the middle of the foyer. Her arrogant smirk completely vanished, replaced by sudden raw panic as she realized she was trapped inside a fortress with a woman she thought she had just destroyed. "What did you just do?" she demanded, her voice jumping an entire octave as she backed away. "Unlock that door right now." I turned to face her, moving with absolute terrifying calm. I reached into my diaper bag, bypassing the extra formula and wipes, and pulled out a crisp manila folder. I opened it and held up a notarized document with a vibrant state seal stamped at the very bottom. "This," I said, my voice dangerously even, "is the property deed." Gavin clearly forgot to mention a minor financial detail from 3 years ago, when he blew $2 million on underground poker and almost sent his pristine family firm into bankruptcy. His mother refused to bail him out. He came to me begging. I used my skills to quietly restructure his debts and save him from federal prison. In exchange, I demanded total collateral. Paige stared at the thick parchment paper, her eyes darting across the complex legal text she clearly could not comprehend. "I forced him to transfer the full ownership of this estate into a blind LLC." I continued, stepping closer to her. "An LLC of which I am the sole managing director. I own every brick, every window, and every blade of grass you just threw my belongings onto. Gavin has absolutely zero legal claim to this property." Paige backed away until she bumped hard into a mahogany console table. "You are lying. Gavin said he owned this house outright." "Gavin says a lot of things," I replied coldly. "Just like he said he was going to marry you. Did he also tell you the ring you are currently wearing was bought with stolen investor funds? Because the feds will find that detail highly interesting when they seize it as evidence." Her eyes widened in sheer terror. She looked down at the massive diamond, then back up at my unwavering gaze. "You are currently trespassing inside my home," I stated, checking my watch with deliberate slowness. "You have exactly 3 minutes to take off my silk robe, walk out the back patio door, and get off my property. If you are still here when the timer hits 0, I am calling the police and pressing charges for breaking and entering. And trust me, Paige, you do not want your fingerprints anywhere near the federal investigation that is about to hit Gavin's life." Paige stood paralyzed for 2 agonizing seconds. Then basic self-preservation kicked in. She frantically stripped off the silk robe, throwing it onto the marble floor, revealing her gym clothes underneath. She grabbed her designer handbag and ran toward the back of the house. She fumbled desperately with the manual latch on the patio door, shoved it open, and sprinted out into the yard, nearly tripping over her own heels as she fled toward the street. I walked over, picked up my robe, and calmly relocked the back door. The massive house was finally quiet. I looked down at Lily, who was just starting to stir, her tiny hands reaching up. "We are safe, baby girl," I whispered gently, kissing her forehead. But I knew the silence would not last long. Paige was undoubtedly calling Gavin in a panic right now, and Gavin would immediately call his mother. They were going to retaliate, and they were going to use every ounce of their corrupt wealth to try and crush me. I walked into the kitchen, set the diaper bag on the marble island, and opened my laptop. I had 30 minutes to prepare for the real monster of the family to arrive. The echo of Paige frantically running down the street had barely faded when the real retaliation began. I knew Gavin lacked the courage to face me himself after his mistress failed so spectacularly. He always hid behind his family's wealth when cornered. He ran straight to his mother. Exactly 28 minutes later, the screech of heavy tires shattered the quiet morning. A pair of black luxury SUVs blocked my driveway, violently jumping the curb and tearing up the manicured edge of the lawn. 4 massive men in dark tactical suits stepped out, forming an intimidating perimeter. My eyes bypassed the muscle and fixed entirely on the woman emerging from the lead vehicle. Corinne. My mother-in-law wore a pristine white designer suit and an expression of absolute unrestrained disgust. She marched up the stone pathway, her private security detail flanking her like a royal guard preparing for a siege. I stepped out onto the front porch, pulling the heavy mahogany door shut behind me. The smart lock engaged with a solid, reassuring click. I kept Lily securely harnessed in a baby wrap against my chest, shielding her from the sudden noise. Corinne did not bother with a greeting. She stopped at the bottom of the front steps, refusing to come closer, acting as if my very presence might somehow contaminate her expensive clothing. She snapped her fingers. One of her security guards stepped forward and shoved a thick manila envelope directly into my chest. "You really thought a cheap real estate trick would save you," Corinne sneered, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "Gavin called me in hysterics. You locked his future wife out of his own house. You think you are clever, Bethany, but you are just a stubborn, insignificant nuisance." I opened the envelope, keeping my face completely blank. My eyes scanned the harsh black text. Inside was an emergency court order. It was signed by a local judge I knew played golf with Corinne's husband every single Sunday. The order was legally devastating. It effectively froze every single joint bank account, investment portfolio, and line of credit Gavin and I shared. The accounts were locked pending a full financial investigation. Corinne watched my eyes track across the legal document, hungrily waiting for a reaction. She wanted to see me break. "Every single dollar is locked," she declared, her tone ringing with triumphant cruelty. "Your credit cards will decline. Your bank cards are entirely useless. You cannot even buy a carton of milk for that child strapped to your chest. Gavin will be filing for sole custody by the end of the week, and you will have absolutely no resources to fight him. You will walk into court wearing rags." She stepped up to the first stone stair, looking me up and down with profound revulsion. She was ready to deliver the killing blow, aiming straight for my history. "I told my son not to marry you," Corinne hissed. "People of your breeding never know when they are beaten. Your parents worked on a filthy assembly line until the day they died, scraping by on pennies and living in a metal box. You grew up breathing factory exhaust and thinking you could scrub the cheapness off by marrying into our family. But we are the elite. You are staff, and today you are officially fired from this family." I looked down at the court order, absorbing the numbers, the dates, the aggressive legal freezing of my entire life. Then I looked back up at the woman who had spent 5 years making my existence a living hell. She wanted me to scream. She wanted me to fall to my knees on the hard stone porch and beg for access to my own money so I could feed my newborn daughter. Instead, I carefully folded the document, creasing the edges perfectly, and slid it into the pocket of my cardigan. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly how long it took to draft a motion like this. They had this ready for weeks. Gavin had planned to freeze me out the moment I gave birth. "Are you finished, Corinne?" I asked, my voice steady, entirely devoid of the panic she craved. Her jaw tightened dangerously. She hated my composure. She hated that I was not sobbing on the ground. "You have 24 hours to pack your bags and surrender the keys to this property," she commanded, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "If you are still here tomorrow morning, I will have my men drag you out in handcuffs. I own the police chief in this district. Do not test me." She turned sharply, waving a dismissive hand to signal her guards. The massive men piled back into the luxury vehicles. I stood perfectly still on the porch and watched them reverse forcefully out of my driveway, the heavy tires leaving deep, muddy gashes in the green grass. The street returned to silence, but the reality of my situation was incredibly stark. I stood completely alone on the porch with a sleeping newborn. I had a locked house but absolutely zero liquid cash. Corinne had successfully cut off my financial oxygen supply. She thought she had starved me out. She thought I was completely isolated, penniless, and defenseless against a billionaire family's wrath. But as the dust settled from Corinne's aggressive departure, a sleek black Mercedes-Benz rounded the corner. It glided smoothly into my driveway, stopping precisely where Corinne's vehicle had just been. The tinted window rolled down and the powerful engine purred to a quiet stop. The driver's side door opened. Simone stepped out. My sister-in-law looked immaculate in a sharp, tailored charcoal pantsuit, her natural hair styled perfectly, her heels clicking against the pavement with absolute authority. Simone was a brilliant African-American corporate attorney, married to Gavin's older brother, Leo. For years, the family had treated her with the exact same veiled condescension they directed at me. They loved parading her impressive legal credentials when it suited their corporate diversity image, while silently excluding her from their inner circle and ignoring her brilliant advice. Simone walked around the front of the car carrying a massive, heavy-looking leather briefcase. She did not look scared. She looked like a woman going to war. She looked up at me, her sharp eyes scanning the empty street before locking intensely onto mine. "Get in," Simone said, her voice firm and ringing with absolute purpose. "They think they have starved you out. They do not know I kept the receipts." I slid into the plush passenger seat of the Mercedes-Benz, pulling the heavy door shut behind me. The thick glass instantly silenced the morning traffic and completely blocked out the sight of my ruined front lawn. I carefully settled Lily into the rear-facing car seat that Simone had surprisingly already installed in the back row. Simone hit the gas before I even had my seatbelt securely clicked, speeding away from the upscale neighborhood I had called home for the past 5 years. I looked over at my sister-in-law. Simone and I had never been particularly close. Gavin and his mother Corinne had always carefully orchestrated family events to keep the wives isolated from one another, breeding a silent and subtle competition between us. But right now, her hands gripped the leather steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity that perfectly mirrored my own internal rage. Simone did not waste time with polite pleasantries. She announced flatly that she was filing for divorce from Gavin's brother Leo by the end of the week. She said she had spent the last 4 years functioning as their highly paid corporate cleanup crew, only to be treated like an entirely expendable asset. Simone kept her eyes locked on the road, her voice sharp and steady as she navigated the morning traffic. She explained exactly how Corinne paraded her around at high-profile charity galas and wealthy shareholder meetings. Corinne loved introducing Simone as the firm's progressive diversity hire, using her presence to win over liberal investors and project a modern corporate image. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Simone was working 90-hour weeks personally, saving the corrupt family firm from 3 separate Securities and Exchange Commission audits. They smiled in her face and happily took the public credit for her brilliant legal maneuvering, while privately mocking her background the moment she left the boardroom. I nodded, feeling a deep wave of understanding wash over me. We were both outsiders who had been used to build their pristine empire only to be discarded when we became inconvenient. Simone reached over to the center console and handed me a heavy silver flash drive. She told me to plug it into my computer immediately. She explained that while she was preparing her strategic exit from Leo, she started quietly pulling the firm's internal financial records. She originally just wanted leverage for her divorce settlement, but what she found buried in the servers was a massive, sprawling criminal enterprise. Simone revealed that Gavin and Corinne were not just dipping into petty cash or bending tax laws. They had been actively embezzling from their oldest and most loyal investors. They were systematically siphoning millions of dollars to fund the lavish lifestyle Gavin had promised his mistress Paige. Those massive diamond rings, the imported luxury cars, and the extravagant tropical vacations they shamelessly flaunted on social media were all paid for with stolen retirement funds. I pulled my laptop from my bag, resting it on my knees as the car sped down the highway. I inserted the flash drive. Folders upon folders of encrypted bank statements, highly classified wire transfers, and offshore routing numbers populated my screen. As my eyes scanned the dense data, Simone dropped the ultimate bombshell. She told me they were not just stealing the money, they were actively framing me for the entire operation. Simone explained that Gavin had somehow accessed my secure home office laptop months ago. He had stolen my certified public accountant credentials and duplicated my digital signature. Corinne and Gavin had carefully orchestrated a fake paper trail designed specifically to make it look like I was the mastermind behind a $20 million deficit. Simone's voice grew incredibly tight with anger as she detailed their sinister plan. They wanted to use my working-class background against me in a court of law. They planned to paint me as a desperate, greedy woman from a Detroit trailer park who embezzled millions to escape poverty. Their ultimate goal was to send me to federal prison for decades, leaving Gavin as the sole wealthy victim who would naturally receive full custody of Lily. I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop. For a split second, the sheer magnitude of their betrayal threatened to suffocate me. My own husband had not only discarded me and our newborn daughter, but he had actively planned to lock me in a concrete cage so he could play house with his mistress using stolen money. Then my intense forensic accounting training kicked in. The columns of numbers on the screen stopped being terrifying and started becoming weapons. I began tracing the digital footprints Gavin thought he had so cleverly disguised. He was incredibly arrogant, but he was also incredibly sloppy. I watched the data points align in my mind, forming a crystal clear picture of their sheer, unrestrained greed. I scrolled past the $20 million mark Simone had mentioned. I kept scrolling. The diverted funds kept compounding, hidden behind ridiculous layers of shell companies and easily disprovable fake vendor invoices. A sudden, sharp laugh escaped my lips. The sound startled Simone so much that she briefly swerved in her lane. She glanced over at me, clearly worried that the extreme stress of the morning had finally broken my sanity. I turned the laptop screen toward her so she could see the final aggregate total I had just highlighted. I told Simone that her initial estimate of $20 million was significantly off. I pointed to the final number buried deep in a nested spreadsheet. They had not stolen $20 million. They had stolen $50 million. Simone let out a sharp, shocked breath, her eyes widening at the staggering amount. But I was not finished. I tapped my finger against a specific string of digits on the screen. It was a highly secure routing number for an offshore account located in the Cayman Islands. Gavin had used it to funnel the most recent batch of stolen investor funds just 3 days ago. I looked at Simone and smiled a genuine, incredibly dangerous smile. I told her that Gavin and Corinne had just made a fatal, irreversible mistake. They thought they were brilliantly framing a helpless, unemployed housewife. They did not know they had just used the exact offshore routing number I had already flagged and submitted to the Internal Revenue Service 6 months ago during my undercover work. Every single dollar they transferred into that account was currently being monitored by the federal government. They had walked right into the kill zone. Simone stared at the glowing screen, her sharp legal mind instantly processing the magnitude of the trap Gavin and Corinne had blindly stepped into. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face, perfectly mirroring my own. We were no longer just two outcasts who had married into a toxic dynasty. We were the architects of their absolute destruction. Simone offered to stay in the climate-controlled Mercedes with Lily. The tinted windows and heavy locks provided a temporary fortress. I needed to go up to my accounting firm, Harrison and Associates, to retrieve my physical hard drives. Those drives contained the final set of encryption keys required to map the $50 million directly back to Corinne's personal signature. The headquarters occupied the entire 14th floor of a sleek downtown high-rise. I rode the elevator up, mentally preparing to download the last batch of ledgers and walk away from my day job forever. But the moment the silver doors slid open, I knew the battlefield had shifted again. The usual frantic hum of ringing phones and clacking keyboards had ceased entirely. Dozens of my colleagues were standing rigidly at their cubicles, staring at the floor or nervously shuffling papers. No one met my eye. I walked down the central corridor toward my glass-walled senior partner suite, my heels sinking into the heavy carpet. Sitting behind my custom oak desk, casually spinning in my ergonomic chair with his feet propped up on my keyboard, was Gavin. He wore a bespoke navy suit and an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. Standing awkwardly to his right was my managing director, Arthur Harrison. Arthur looked pale, his hands nervously clutching a single piece of heavy corporate letterhead. I stopped in the doorway. I did not blink. I did not show a single ounce of the shock Gavin was desperately hoping to provoke. Gavin dropped his feet to the floor and stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a theatrical flourish. He walked around my desk, stepping into the open doorway so the entire office floor could hear his performance. "Bethany," Gavin said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room, "I was just having a fascinating chat with Arthur here about the ethical standards required of a senior accountant. Standards you have apparently completely abandoned." I looked at Arthur. He refused to meet my gaze, keeping his eyes glued to the piece of paper in his hands. Gavin's family firm represents 40% of our annual billings, Bethany, Arthur said, his voice tight and overly formal. He has brought forward some highly disturbing allegations regarding your handling of their private accounts, claims of gross financial misconduct and unauthorized fund transfers. Gavin smirked, stepping closer to me. We cannot have a criminal managing the books, Arthur. It is bad for business. Arthur finally held out the paper. Effective immediately, your employment at Harrison and Associates is terminated. We will be cooperating fully with the internal investigation Gavin's family is launching. Please pack your personal belongings. Security will escort you out. I took the termination letter. The sheer audacity of Gavin's strategy was almost impressive. He knew I had locked him out of the estate and cornered Paige, so he retaliated by attacking my professional credibility. He was trying to publicly brand me as an embezzler before I could expose his own massive fraud. He wanted to strip away my income, my home, and my reputation all in a single morning. Gavin leaned against the glass frame of my office door, projecting his voice so every single junior accountant and administrative assistant could hear his final verdict. It is truly a tragedy, Gavin announced to the room, shaking his head with mock sympathy. She's unstable, a thief. She can't even take care of her own baby. The postpartum psychosis has completely detached her from reality. It is a miracle I got Lily out of her custody before she did something unforgivable. A few gasps echoed from the cubicles. He was laying the groundwork for his emergency custody petition right there in the middle of a corporate office. He was painting me as a deranged, thieving mother, knowing human resources would record every single word of this interaction. He expected me to lose my temper. He wanted me to scream, to throw a punch, to physically attack him in front of 50 witnesses. That would give Corinne the police report she needed to lock me in a psychiatric ward by sunset. I carefully folded the termination letter and placed it into my bag. I grabbed an empty cardboard banker's box from the corner of the room. Moving with slow, deliberate precision, I packed my framed diplomas, my ergonomic mouse, and the specific encrypted hard drive disguised as a metallic paperweight. I left the company laptop exactly where it was. I picked up the box and walked back toward the door. Gavin blocked the exit, his chest puffed out, waiting for me to beg. Move, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, carrying a tone so heavy and cold that his arrogant smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He stepped aside. I stopped directly in front of Arthur. I looked deep into my boss's pale face. I gave him a single sharp nod of acknowledgement. Arthur swallowed hard and gave a microscopic nod in return. I walked out of the suite and marched straight toward the elevator banks. The heavy silence of the office followed me the entire way. The elevator doors closed, shutting out Gavin's triumphant laughter. I stepped out of the high-rise lobby and into the bright morning sun, walking briskly toward Simone's waiting Mercedes. As I reached the car door, my hidden burner phone vibrated aggressively in my pocket. I set the cardboard box on the hood of the car and pulled out the cheap plastic device. I opened the encrypted messaging application. The text was from Arthur. Cover maintained. Excellent restraint upstairs. The FBI raid on Gavin's firm is officially approved for the 30th. Keep him distracted until the gala. I locked the screen and slid the phone back into my pocket. Gavin thought he had just fired a helpless accountant. He had no idea he was dealing with an embedded federal agent, and he had just ensured his entire family would be wearing handcuffs before the end of the month. I settled into the unassuming two-bedroom apartment Simone had secured under a shell corporation. It was a far cry from the sprawling luxury of my estate, but it was a tactical safe house entirely off Corinne and Gavin's radar. Or so I thought. I had barely finished feeding Lily and placing her in the portable bassinet when a sharp, aggressive pounding rattled the flimsy front door. I checked the peephole. Gavin stood in the narrow hallway wearing a smug grin, accompanied by a sharp-featured man in a cheap beige suit holding a thick leather binder. I opened the door just enough to block the entryway, keeping my posture completely relaxed. Gavin pushed his weight against the wood, forcing the door open and stepping into my temporary sanctuary without an ounce of hesitation. He looked around the modest living room, sneering at the basic furniture, the scuffed laminate flooring, and the lack of high-end artwork. "This is exactly what I mean, Dr. Eris," Gavin said, gesturing broadly to the room with profound disgust. "She is living in absolute squalor. She has completely lost her mind." He turned to me, slapping a thick stack of legal papers directly onto the small dining table. He announced he was officially suing for sole immediate custody of Lily. He claimed my public termination earlier that morning proved I was entirely unfit, unstable, and a danger to my own child. He had rushed straight to family court, painting a picture of a deranged, unemployed woman who had suffered a massive psychotic break and stolen company data. The man in the beige suit stepped forward, clicking a silver pen. He introduced himself as Dr. Aris, a supposedly independent child services evaluator appointed by the court. He did not bother looking at Lily, who was sleeping peacefully just a few feet away. Instead, he began aggressively inspecting my meager surroundings, shaking his head with exaggerated concern and scribbling furiously on his notepad. He walked into the small kitchenette, running a finger over the laminate countertops, before turning his attention back to me. He cornered me near the sink, his voice dripping with practiced condescension. He noted on his official clipboard that I displayed a highly hostile demeanor simply because I was not answering his rapid-fire accusatory questions. He pointed out my obvious lack of resources, reminding me that all my joint accounts were frozen by a federal judge. He stated that I had no income, no permanent address, and no means to provide a stable environment for an infant. "A child requires stability, Bethany," Dr. Aris lectured, leaning in far too close. "Your husband has a multi-million-dollar estate, unlimited resources, and the backing of a prominent elite family. You have a termination letter, zero income, and an apartment that smells like cheap cleaning supplies. People of your background often struggle to adapt to the pressures of high society motherhood. It is a tragedy, but it is reality." He tapped his pen against the legal documents on the table. "Give Gavin full custody today," Dr. Aris demanded, his tone dropping to a coercive whisper. "Sign the surrender forms right now, and I will personally recommend he provides you with a modest monthly stipend to get back on your feet. If you fight this in court, I will testify under oath that you are a severe risk to your daughter, and you will never see her again. You have no money to hire a lawyer. You are completely outmatched." Gavin stood by the front door, crossing his arms and grinning. He thought he had delivered the ultimate checkmate. He believed I would shatter right there, sacrificing my child just to survive the crushing weight of his family's power. He thought his money could buy the law, buy the state, and buy my daughter. Before I could even form a response, the door to the secondary bedroom swung open. Simone stepped out into the living room, holding her smartphone up. The red recording icon blinked steadily. She had been sitting in the back room analyzing the encrypted ledgers I had retrieved from my office, but she was now fully focused on the two men standing in my kitchen. "Actually," Simone stated, her voice slicing through the room like a perfectly sharpened blade, "as Bethany's legal counsel, I would love you to explain something on the record, Mr. Evaluator." Dr. Aris froze, his pen dropping from his hand and clattering onto the floor. Gavin's arrogant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of profound, paralyzing confusion. He had absolutely no idea his sister-in-law was within 100 miles of this apartment, let alone acting as my attorney. Simone walked forward, never lowering her phone, keeping the camera trained directly on the evaluator's face. "I would love you to explain to the state licensing board exactly why you received a $50,000 wire transfer from Gavin's personal Cayman Islands account yesterday morning," Simone demanded, her tone ringing with absolute authority. "Because according to the financial forensics we just ran, that looks incredibly like a massive illegal bribe to falsify a child custody evaluation." Dr. Aris turned the color of wet ash. He looked at Gavin in sheer terror, his eyes wide and panicked, realizing he had just walked directly into a devastating legal trap. He had traded his career and his freedom for a quick payday, and he was now standing on camera with the evidence stacked perfectly against him. Without saying a single word, the evaluator spun on his heel, shoved past Gavin, and fled out the front door, his heavy footsteps echoing frantically down the hallway. Simone lowered her phone, turning her sharp gaze toward Gavin. He was standing completely alone, his backup gone, his bribe exposed, and his entire strategy collapsing around him. The countdown to the FBI raid was ticking, and he had just handed us the perfect distraction. Gavin stared at the empty space where his highly paid, deeply corrupt evaluator had been standing just seconds before. The sheer panic washing over his face was a portrait of a man realizing his money could no longer insulate him from reality. He turned his desperate gaze toward Simone, then to me before spinning around and marching out of the apartment without uttering a single word. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him, sealing his defeat. Simone let out a sharp breath and locked the deadbolt. We had won the battle, but the war was far from over. We still had to survive until the 30th. Lily began to stir in her bassinet, letting out a hungry cry that immediately shifted my focus. In the chaos of our escape that morning, I had grabbed everything except her specialized hypoallergenic formula. It was a rare brand completely out of stock at standard grocery stores. The only place I knew reliably carried it was a ridiculously overpriced exclusive children's boutique called Petit Trésor, located right in the heart of the city's luxury shopping district. Simone opened her designer wallet and handed me a thick stack of crisp $100 bills, emergency cash, she had withdrawn specifically for situations where credit cards could be tracked. I thanked her, secured Lily in her carrier, and headed out into the afternoon traffic. Petit Trésor was exactly as pretentious as I remembered. The air smelled of lavender and expensive vanilla. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers. The aisles were wide enough to accommodate imported Italian strollers, and the shelves were lined with organic cotton onesies that cost more than a car payment. I navigated straight to the back wall, grabbed 3 heavy tins of the specialized formula, and headed for the marble checkout counter. I placed the tins on the counter and reached into my pocket for Simone's cash. Just as the cashier began ringing up the total, a sharp, instantly recognizable voice echoed across the quiet boutique. "Well, this is absolutely tragic. Look who is counting pennies to feed her child." I stiffened slowly, turning around. Corinne stood in the center of the aisle, wearing a pristine white Chanel suit that screamed old money. Standing right beside her, linking arms with her prospective mother-in-law, was Paige. Paige looked exactly like the woman you would expect Gavin to throw his life away for. She was a walking billboard for conspicuous consumption. She wore oversized sunglasses, indoors, sky-high stiletto boots, and an expression of pure, unadulterated arrogance. Corinne and Paige stepped closer deliberately, trapping me against the checkout counter. The boutique was currently occupied by at least half a dozen other wealthy patrons' wives of elite surgeons and tech executives who instantly stopped browsing to watch the drama unfold. Corinne knew her audience and projected her voice perfectly to ensure maximum humiliation. "Paying with physical cash?" Corinne sneered, looking at the bills in my hand as if they were contaminated. "How remarkably working class. Gavin told me he froze all your accounts this morning. I suppose you are scraping the bottom of the barrel now. Or did you steal that from petty cash before Arthur threw you out of your office?" I looked at Corinne, my face a mask of absolute calm. I refused to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I paid the cashier, took my receipt, and picked up the heavy shopping bag. I tried to step around them, but Paige aggressively blocked my path. Paige raised her left hand, shoving it directly into my line of sight. The overhead lights caught the massive, flawless 5-carat diamond resting heavily on her ring finger. It was ostentatious, blinding, and aggressively expensive. "Gavin buys his real family the best," Paige said, her voice dripping with venomous triumph. She shifted her posture, pulling a stunning limited-edition Himalayan crocodile Birkin bag to the front of her hip, ensuring everyone in the store could admire it. "He told me he is finally upgrading to a woman with actual pedigree, a woman who knows how to represent a dynasty, not some desperate accountant from a trailer park who cannot even keep a job." Corinne laughed, a harsh, cruel sound. "It is a fundamental truth, Bethany. Men of Gavin's stature require a certain caliber of partner. You were always just a placeholder. Now that you are homeless, unemployed, and facing a massive internal investigation, I suggest you simply surrender custody of Lily and walk away quietly. It is the only way you avoid prison." The other patrons in the boutique were whispering openly now, casting judgmental glances in my direction. Paige practically preened under the attention, stroking the textured leather of her extraordinarily rare handbag. I looked at the diamond ring. I looked at the Himalayan Birkin. My mind, rigorously trained in forensic accounting, instantly bypassed the emotional insult and began processing raw financial data. During my chaotic ride with Simone that morning, I had memorized entire spreadsheets of Gavin's illicit transactions. I remembered the exact dates, the exact vendor names, and the exact amounts siphoned from loyal investors to fund his mistress. That specific Birkin bag was not something you simply picked up off a shelf. It required an intense purchase history and a dedicated client profile. It also came with a very specific serialized authentication tag near the base. I smiled. It was a cold, clinical smile that caused Corinne's confident posture to falter. "That is a beautiful handbag, Paige," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent boutique. "A rare piece like that retails for roughly $85,000 on the secondary market, does it not?" Paige smirked, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "90,000 actually. Gavin had it flown in from Paris last Tuesday." "Tuesday?" I repeated, my tone sharpening. "Fascinating." I pulled my hidden burner phone from my pocket. I stepped forward, violating Paige's personal space. Before she could pull away, I angled my phone toward the exposed underside of the bag, snapping a high-resolution photo of the barcode and serial number stamped into the leather authentication tab hanging near the handle base. "What are you doing?" Paige demanded, yanking the bag back and taking a defensive step toward Corinne. "Get away from me." I looked down at the screen, letting the application scan the barcode while comparing the digits to the photographic memory of the ledgers burned into my brain. The numbers aligned perfectly. It was an exact match. I looked back up at Paige, holding her gaze with terrifying intensity. "Interesting," I said, raising my voice so every single wealthy patron in the store could hear me crystal clear. "That exact barcode and serial number correspond to an invoice processed last Tuesday. But Gavin did not buy that bag with his personal wealth. He purchased it using a corporate American Express card ending in 4022. Corinne's face lost all its color. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She knew exactly what that card number meant. "That specific corporate card," I continued, stepping closer as Paige shrank back against a display of cashmere blankets, "is registered to a shell company currently under active massive investigation for investor fraud. He bought your Birkin bag, and likely that 5-carat diamond using stolen retirement funds siphoned directly from his oldest clients." The wealthy women browsing the store suddenly gasped, their expressions shifting from passive entertainment to absolute shock and disgust. In their elite circles, being poor was a sin, but stealing from fellow investors was an unforgivable crime. I leaned in, dropping my voice to a deadly precise pitch that only Paige and Corinne could hear. "Every item he bought you with that card is classified as stolen property," I stated. "When the federal agents come knocking, and they will be coming very soon, they will seize the ring, the bag, and the imported cars. Enjoy carrying a federal felony on your arm, Paige." I turned my back on them, picked up my formula, and walked out of the boutique. I left them standing frozen in the middle of the store, completely humiliated, surrounded by the horrified whispers of the exact high society peers they had tried to impress. I walked out of Petit Trésor with my head held high, the heavy tins of formula swinging against my leg in the crisp afternoon air. The adrenaline from cornering Paige and Corinne was still burning through my veins, making my hands shake slightly, but my mind was operating with absolute crystalline clarity. I navigated the bustling luxury district, ignoring the stares of the wealthy shoppers, and headed straight for a secluded, dimly lit espresso bar 3 blocks away. Simone was already sitting in a leather booth in the back, nursing a black coffee. I slid in across from her, setting the formula down, and relayed every single detail of the confrontation. Simone's eyes gleamed with a predatory satisfaction as she absorbed the information. She knew as well as I did that Corinne would have been speed-dialing Gavin the exact second I stepped out of that boutique. We had officially backed the rat into a corner. We had stripped away his feeling of invincibility. And cornered, panicked rats always make desperate, reckless mistakes. We did not have to wait long for Gavin to make his move. Simone's phone suddenly chimed with a high-priority encrypted security alert. When we had first secured my temporary apartment, Simone had insisted on outfitting the space with top-tier surveillance. Anticipating Gavin's underhanded aggressive tactics, she had discreetly installed a series of motion-activated micro-cameras disguised as standard smoke detectors and electrical outlet covers. She tapped the notification, bringing up a live, high-definition video feed of my modest living room. We sat in the quiet, lavender-scented cafe, watching in real time as the deadbolt on my apartment door was expertly and silently picked. A man dressed in unremarkable dark clothing slipped inside. He moved with the cold, targeted precision of a hired professional. He did not look for cash. He did not touch the television or the meager jewelry box sitting on the dresser. He had clearly been given highly specific instructions. We watched him walk straight down the narrow hallway and drop to his knees next to a small painted ventilation grate near the baseboards. He pulled a screwdriver from his pocket, quickly removed the metal cover, and shoved a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope deep into the ductwork. He replaced the grate, wiped down the metal with a cloth, and vanished out the front door. The entire intrusion lasted less than 90 seconds. Simone and I exchanged a single knowing look. Gavin was terrified. He realized I possessed the specific tracking numbers for his embezzled offshore accounts, and he knew his mistress was currently walking around wearing the primary evidence. His only remaining play was to definitively legally frame me before the federal agents closed in and froze his assets. We left the cafe, immediately driving back to the apartment with calculated urgency. We needed to intercept whatever radioactive material Gavin's proxy had just planted before the trap could be sprung. The moment we stepped inside the apartment, I bypassed the kitchen and went straight for the hallway. I grabbed a screwdriver, removed the grate, and pulled out the heavy manila envelope. I carried it to the small dining table and dumped its contents onto the laminate surface. It was a masterpiece of corporate forgery. There were dozens of backdated tax returns, fabricated wire transfer authorizations, and fake offshore account applications registered under a dummy corporation that utilized my maiden name. Every single document was meticulously stamped with my stolen digital signature and my certified public accountant credentials. Gavin had manufactured a flawless, damning paper trail explicitly designed to prove I was the sole mastermind behind the missing $50 million. If law enforcement found this envelope in my possession, I would be denied bail. I would be permanently stripped of my maternal rights. I would spend the rest of my life in a federal penitentiary while Gavin played the role of the tragic, betrayed husband. But Gavin's fatal flaw was his arrogance. He assumed I was a terrified, passive victim cowering in the dark. He never considered that I was actively hunting him. Simone opened her leather briefcase and pulled out a fresh, unmarked manila envelope. Inside it was the master ledger. The raw, unredacted financial records I had extracted from his firm's deepest, most heavily encrypted servers just before he fired me. These pages contained Gavin's actual, verified electronic signatures. They documented his direct IP address logs, linking his personal laptop to the Cayman Island accounts. They included the internal corporate memos, explicitly authorizing the fraudulent transfers to Page's shell companies. It was absolute, irrefutable proof of his guilt, compiled by the best forensic accountant he had ever hired. I gathered up his forged documents and fed them one by one into the heavy-duty paper shredder Simone had brought to the safe house. I took the master ledger, sealed it inside the new envelope, and shoved it deep into the hallway ventilation duct. I screwed the grate back into the wall, carefully wiping away any trace of my fingerprints. We packed up Lily, walked out of the apartment, and drove right back to our table at the espresso bar. 2 hours later, my hidden burner phone illuminated with an incoming call from an unregistered number. I answered it, putting it on speaker and setting it flat on the cafe table so Simone could listen. "Bethany," Gavin said. His voice was dripping with an oily, sickeningly sweet confidence. The panic that must have consumed him after Corinne's phone call had been completely replaced by arrogant triumph. "I hope you are enjoying your little squatter's den. I hear you have been causing a scene at retail stores today. It is really pathetic lashing out because you are broke and desperate." "What do you want, Gavin?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat, feigning exhaustion and defeat. "I just wanted to do you a professional courtesy," Gavin continued, practically purring into the receiver. "You see, an anonymous, highly concerned citizen just contacted the local authorities. They tipped off the financial crimes unit that a disgruntled, terminated accountant might be hoarding stolen corporate documents and illicit funds in her temporary residence. He paused, letting his cruel threat hang heavily in the air. "The police are on their way to your apartment right now, Bethany," Gavin gloated, his voice hardening into a vicious, triumphant sneer. "They have a search warrant. They are going to tear that place apart, and when they find what is hidden in your vents, you are going to be arrested for grand larceny and federal fraud. You will be behind bars by dinner, and I will have a judge grant me full permanent custody of Lily by tomorrow morning. You lost. It is over." Simone took a slow sip of her coffee, raising a perfectly sculpted eyebrow at me. I leaned closer to the phone, my voice steady, completely devoid of the panic Gavin was desperately craving. "Let the police search the house, Gavin," I told him calmly. The line went dead silent for a fraction of a second. I could practically hear his brain struggling to process my absolute lack of fear. "Because Simone and I replaced those forged tax documents with the original unredacted ledgers bearing your actual signature 3 hours ago." I said, my words slicing through the silence like a scalpel. "You just tipped off the cops to your own crime." Simone navigated the Mercedes through the congested afternoon traffic, pulling up to the curb directly across from the imposing concrete facade of the downtown police precinct. The Financial Crimes Unit had requested my immediate presence to verify the authenticity of the unredacted ledgers the patrol officers had just extracted from my apartment's ventilation duct. I stepped out of the car, the crisp wind whipping my coat around my legs, but before I could even set foot on the wide concrete stairs leading to the entrance, a black Porsche Cayenne violently hopped the curb tires, screeching against the pavement. Gavin threw his door open before the vehicle even came to a complete stop. He stumbled out, his usually immaculate hair plastered to his forehead with nervous sweat, his silk tie yanked loose. He looked absolutely terrified. Right behind him, stepping out of the passenger side with forced, rigid dignity, was Corinne. Her pristine designer coat was buttoned perfectly, but her jaw was set so tightly I could practically hear her teeth grinding. They had tracked Simone's car, desperate to intercept me, before I walked through those glass precinct doors, and permanently sealed their fate. Gavin lunged forward, blocking my path to the stairs. He looked frantically at the police officers walking in and out of the building, keeping his voice to a harsh, desperate hiss. "They have the original files." Gavin choked out, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon. "The detectives just called my attorney. They are reviewing the signature logs right now. You set me up. You planted those ledgers to destroy my life. You sent a man to break into my home and plant forged documents to frame me for a federal crime." I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I simply corrected your error. Now move out of my way." "Enough," Corinne snapped, stepping between us and shoving her son back with a sharp, commanding hand. She looked at me with eyes as cold and dead as winter ice. She was not panicking like Gavin. She was calculating. She reached into her oversized leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, legal-sized folio, slapping it hard against Gavin's chest before turning her full attention to me. "We are going to resolve this right now, Bethany," Corinne dictated, her tone leaving zero room for negotiation. "You are going to walk into that police station and tell the detectives that the ledgers they found were drafts. You are going to sign a sworn affidavit stating that you manipulated Gavin's digital signature, and that the missing $50 million is the result of a minor accounting error on your part. You will take full responsibility for the discrepancy, and you will state that Gavin had absolutely no knowledge of the missing funds." I stared at her, genuinely astounded by the sheer magnitude of her delusion. She wanted me to walk into a police precinct and confess to a massive federal fraud just to keep her precious son out of a prison cell. "And why on earth would I do that?" I asked. Corinne's lips curled into a predatory, razor-thin smile. She opened the folio, pulling out a freshly drafted, highly restrictive non-disclosure agreement. "Because if you sign this NDA and take the fall for this minor accounting error, we will wire $10 million into an offshore account in your name by midnight," Corinne stated, tapping a manicured fingernail against the signature line. "Furthermore, Gavin will immediately withdraw his emergency petition. You will be granted full uncontested custody of Lily." You get your daughter, you get more money than you could ever spend, and you disappear. Gavin nodded eagerly, his panic momentarily subsiding as he watched his mother weaponize their wealth. He actually believed I would take the bribe. He truly thought my integrity had a price tag. I looked down at the contract, remaining perfectly still. I needed them to believe I was carefully weighing my options. I needed them to think I was a desperate mother backed into a corner, completely terrified of their power. Corinne sensed my intentional hesitation and instantly moved in for the kill. She stepped so close I could smell the heavy, expensive perfume radiating from her coat. If you don't take the deal, we will tie you up in litigation until your daughter is in college. Corinne threatened, her voice dropping to a low, vicious register. You have no money to fight us. I will personally hire a dozen law firms to file motion after motion, burying you in legal fees until you are starving on the street. I will make sure the court evaluates every single aspect of your working-class background. I will paint you as an unstable, greedy, unfit mother, and I will drag this out until you break. You will never see Lily again. Take the money, take your child, and sign the paper. Simone stood silently a few feet away, her hands tucked into her pockets. She did not intervene. She knew exactly what I was doing. I let out a long, shaky breath, allowing my shoulders to slump. I dropped my gaze to the pavement, acting the part of a broken, defeated woman who had just realized she could never win against a billion-dollar dynasty. I slowly reached out and took the expensive silver pen Corinne was holding toward me. I'll sign it, I said, my voice quiet and seemingly resigned. Gavin let out a massive, audible sigh of relief, his arrogant smirk instantly returning to his face. Corinne's eyes gleamed with absolute triumph. She had bought her way out of another scandal. But I have one condition, I added, looking back up, meeting Corinne's icy stare directly. Corinne rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed by the delay. What is it? I will sign this NDA, and I will take the fall for your minor accounting error. I told them, my voice growing steady and firm. But only if you announce our divorce and my resignation publicly at your 30th anniversary corporate gala tomorrow night. I want everyone in your elite social circle to know exactly what happened. I want you to look your investors in the eye and tell them I am leaving. Gavin practically laughed out loud, shaking his head at what he perceived to be a pathetic, prideful demand. He thought I just wanted a formal public acknowledgement of my exit. He had no idea the gala was the exact location I had designated for the federal raid. Done, Gavin said smugly, adjusting his tie and standing tall once again. Tomorrow night, in front of 500 of our wealthiest investors, I will personally announce that I am divorcing you and terminating your employment. It will be the perfect way to clean house. Corinne nodded in agreement, handing me the folio. I signed my name on the dotted line, handing the worthless piece of paper back to her. They turned and walked back to their Porsche, completely blinded by their apparent victory. They thought they had just saved their empire. They did not realize they had just agreed to invite every single one of their victims to the exact event where the FBI would be placing them in handcuffs. Simone navigated us away from the precinct, leaving Gavin and Corinne in our rearview mirror. The moment the heavy deadbolt of our temporary apartment clicked shut, the carefully crafted mask of the defeated, desperate wife vanished from my face. I moved straight to the dining table, clearing away Lily's formula tins to spread out the digital blueprints Simone had procured. They were the architectural layouts for the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, the venue for the Sterling firm's 30th anniversary gala. We had exactly 24 hours to synchronize our timeline with the federal agents. He took the bait entirely, Simone stated, dropping her leather briefcase onto a nearby chair and booting up her encrypted laptop. Gavin is so blinded by his own astronomical ego that he actually believes you submitted to his authority outside that station. He thinks public humiliation will be your ultimate punishment. He needs the audience, I replied, tracing the layout of the ballroom exits and the main stage with my index finger. Corinne and Gavin operate entirely on optics. They need their elite investors to see them firmly in control, publicly excising the alleged bad apple. They are throwing a coronation disguised as an anniversary party. We spent the entire night and the following morning reviewing the final pieces of our tactical puzzle. The master ledger was safely in federal custody, extracted during the raid Gavin had unwittingly orchestrated upon himself. The Financial Crimes Unit was currently untangling the massive web of shell companies, matching the offshore routing numbers directly to Page's luxury assets and Gavin's hidden personal portfolios. The $50 million was accounted for entirely untouched by my credentials. The trap was set. By noon on the day of the gala, Simone's laptop chimed with a high-priority intercepted email. She had spent the morning monitoring Gavin's executive communications through a back door she installed weeks ago. Her eyes narrowed sharply as she scanned the decrypted text. "We have a severe complication," Simone announced, turning the screen toward me. "Gavin just finalized an emergency contract with a private high-tier security firm. He hired 6 additional plainclothes guards specifically assigned to you for tonight." I read over the tactical instructions attached to the invoice. Gavin's plan was brutally simple and highly effective. The moment I signed the physical non-disclosure agreement on the podium, effectively confessing to the missing funds in front of the entire elite crowd, these guards were ordered to immediately surround me. They were instructed to forcefully escort me out through the kitchen service elevators before I could utter a single word into the microphone. He was ensuring I would be a silent, compliant scapegoat. "He wants to silence you the exact second the ink dries," Simone warned, tapping the screen. "If they drag you out of that ballroom, Corinne will immediately take the microphone and spin a tragic, convincing tale about your mental collapse and subsequent resignation. The investors will buy it, and Gavin will retain his pristine image until the indictments drop weeks from now. You will not get your moment to expose them. Then I will simply have to make sure they cannot look away from me," I said, my voice cold and resolute. "I will make myself entirely untouchable." I walked into the bedroom and unzipped the garment bag Simone had smuggled in earlier that morning. For 5 years under Corinne's suffocating tyrannical rule, my wardrobe had been strictly monitored and heavily policed. She had forced me into drab, shapeless beige pantsuits and modest, high-collared navy dresses. She constantly reminded me that a woman of my low-class origins needed to blend in to remain invisible so as not to embarrass Gavin's historic dynasty. I was expertly molded into the perfect, unassuming background character. Not tonight. I pulled the heavy fabric from the bag and let it fall around me. It was a custom-tailored floor-length silk gown in a brilliant, unapologetic shade of power red. It featured a sharp, asymmetrical neckline and a daring thigh-high slit that commanded absolute attention. It was the exact opposite of everything Corinne stood for. It was a visual declaration of war. I slipped into the gown, feeling the luxurious silk settle perfectly against my skin. I pinned my hair back in a sleek, severe style, completely abandoning the soft, submissive waves Gavin had always demanded I wear. I applied a bold crimson lipstick, staring at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The terrified, overworked accountant from the trailer park was dead. The woman staring back at me was a predator perfectly prepared to dismantle an empire. Simone walked into the doorway, leaning against the frame and letting out a low whistle of approval. "Corinne is going to have a stroke the second you walk through those double doors." "That is the general idea," I replied, slipping on a pair of towering stiletto heels. A sharp, heavy knock echoed from the front door, interrupting our preparation. Simone instantly went rigid, her hand dropping seamlessly to the concealed holster at her hip. We were not expecting company, and Gavin's security apparatus was already on high alert. She moved silently down the hall to the peephole, peering out into the corridor. After a tense second, her shoulders relaxed slightly. "It is a bonded courier," Simone reported, keeping her voice low. "Standard uniform. He is holding a package addressed directly to you." I opened the door just enough to accept the delivery, signing the digital pad without a single word. The courier nodded and disappeared down the hall. I carried the heavy, velvet-wrapped box back to the dining table. There was no return address, only a specific series of alphanumeric codes printed on the shipping label. I recognized the cipher immediately. It was the secure communication protocol used by Special Agent Thorne, my primary undercover contact within the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. I broke the wax seal and lifted the lid. Resting on a bed of black satin was a breathtaking diamond-encrusted pendant necklace. It was a flawless piece of high-end jewelry, perfectly suited for a billionaire's anniversary gala. But as I lifted the heavy platinum chain to the light, I noticed the microscopic anomaly. Nestled seamlessly between the center stones was a state-of-the-art high-definition microcamera. Tucked beneath the necklace was a small, crisp white card bearing a typed message. I read the words aloud to Simone, feeling a cold electric thrill wash over me. "We are in position. Give us the signal tonight." I fastened the platinum clasp at the nape of my neck, feeling the cool, heavy weight of the diamond pendant settle against my collarbone. The microcamera was utterly invisible to the naked eye, but I knew it was there, capturing every single angle of the room in high definition. I tapped the center stone twice, the prearranged signal to Agent Thorne. A tiny, imperceptible vibration against my chest confirmed the live feed was active. The FBI was watching. The net was fully deployed. The Pierre Hotel ballroom was a masterclass in aggressive, unapologetic wealth. As I stepped out of the black town car and approached the grand entrance, the crisp New York air whipped at the hem of my gown. The 30th anniversary gala of the sterling investment firm was not just a party. It was a summit of power. 500 of the most influential people in the city were inside. There were tech billionaires, elite politicians, and old money aristocrats, all mingling under cascading crystal chandeliers and towering arrangements of white orchids. These were the exact people Gavin had systematically robbed to fund his extravagant lifestyle and his mistress. Tonight they were drinking champagne paid for with their own stolen retirement funds. I pushed through the heavy mahogany doors and stepped into the grand ballroom. For 5 years I had attended these corporate functions as a shadow. Corinne had always strictly mandated my wardrobe, forcing me into shapeless, muted beige suits or conservative navy dresses that swallowed my figure. She had designed me to be the invisible, mousy accountant wife who never drew attention away from her golden son. Tonight the mousy accountant was dead. The custom-tailored silk gown I wore was a brilliant, predatory shade of power red. It featured a sharp, asymmetrical neckline and a daring thigh-high slit that demanded absolute attention. In a sea of guests wearing monotonous black tuxedos and understated silver evening gowns, I looked like a lit match dropped into a dry forest. The effect was instantaneous. Heads turned the second I crossed the threshold. The low hum of elite networking faltered as eyes locked onto the woman they had all dismissed as Gavin's placeholder wife. Whispers rippled through the crowd, spreading like a current across the ballroom floor. I kept my posture rigid and my chin high, scanning the room until my gaze locked with Corinne. She was standing near the edge of the grand stage holding a crystal flute of champagne. The moment she saw me, her rigid aristocratic composure fractured. Her jaw tightened so hard I could practically see the muscles straining beneath her skin. The red dress was a blatant act of defiance, an unforgivable violation of the aesthetic control she had maintained over me for half a decade. Beside her stood Gavin, adjusting his custom tuxedo cuffs. He was flanked by the 6 plainclothes security guards he had hired specifically to throw me out the back door. Gavin noticed his mother's shock and followed her gaze. When he saw me, a smug, arrogant grin spread across his face. He clearly believed the red dress was my final desperate attempt to look dignified before I was forced to confess to federal fraud and surrender my child. He patted his breast pocket, where he undoubtedly kept the signed non-disclosure agreement, entirely unaware that a team of federal agents was currently watching him smile. Paige, however, lacked the discipline to simply wait for the trap to spring. She detached herself from Gavin's side, her eyes blazing with territorial fury. Paige was wearing a blindingly expensive silver gown that clung to her like a second skin, the stolen 5-carat diamond glittering aggressively under the ballroom lights. She could not stand the fact that the room was looking at me instead of her. She needed to assert her dominance immediately. She needed to put the trailer park girl back in her place. I watched calmly as Paige grabbed a full glass of dark Cabernet from a passing waiter's silver tray. She locked eyes with me and began weaving through the crowd, marching directly into my path. She moved with the reckless confidence of a woman who believed she had already won the war. Paige closed the final few feet between us and deliberately feigned a stumble. She shoved her arm forward, thrusting the glass of dark red wine directly toward the bodice of my gown. But I was no longer the passive victim she expected. I anticipated the strike before her heel even hit the marble floor. I swiftly pivoted my hips, stepping back just enough so that the cascading wine completely missed the center of my dress. A few drops grazed the lower hem, instantly blending into the deep crimson silk, rendering her attempted sabotage entirely useless. Paige caught her balance, her face flushing with anger when she realized her petty attack had failed. She stepped deeply into my personal space, her breath smelling of expensive alcohol and pure malice. "You don't belong here, loser," Paige whispered, her voice a venomous hiss meant only for my ears. "Enjoy your final 5 minutes of pretending you are somebody. Gavin is going to destroy you on that stage, and I am going to be the one raising your daughter." I did not flinch. I did not step back, and I did not look away. My heart rate remained remarkably steady. I reached out toward a paralyzed server standing frozen next to us and smoothly lifted a full flute of vintage champagne from his tray. I held Paige's gaze with absolute terrifying calm. Without a single shift in my expression, I raised my right hand and slowly, deliberately upended the entire glass of champagne directly over the crown of her meticulously styled hair. The ice-cold, bubbling liquid cascaded down Paige's face, instantly ruining her expensive makeup and soaking the front of her silver designer gown. The champagne dripped from her nose and chin, flattening her hair against her skull. She stood paralyzed by the sheer, unimaginable shock of my retaliation. "Just washing the trash off my shoes," I said, my voice projecting clearly and effortlessly across the space between us. Paige let out a piercing, hysterical scream that cut through the ballroom like a siren. The jazz quartet on the stage abruptly stopped playing, the final notes ending in a discordant screech of strings. 500 elite guests, politicians, and billionaires simultaneously froze in their tracks, turning their collective horrified gaze toward the commotion. The clinking of glasses ceased entirely. The hushed whispers evaporated. The entire grand ballroom went dead silent, the stage perfectly set for the destruction of the Sterling Empire. The echo of Paige's shriek hung in the cavernous ballroom, sharp and desperate. Champagne dripped from the ends of her ruined hair, staining her silver designer gown and pooling on the polished marble floor. The 500 elite guests, the titans of industry, the politicians, and the billionaires stood completely paralyzed. No one dared to speak. No one even breathed. Gavin's face flushed a deep, mottled purple. The carefully constructed illusion of his perfect, untouchable life was cracking in front of his most vital investors. He looked at Paige, sobbing and humiliated, then snapped his gaze to me. His eyes were wild with a frantic, cornered energy. He realized instantly that the silent, compliant exit he had orchestrated for me was no longer an option. He needed to seize the narrative immediately before the whispers turning through the crowd morphed into questions. He gave a sharp, discreet hand signal. Two of the plainclothes security guards materialized from the shadows, flanking Paige and swiftly guiding her toward a side exit, hiding her ruined state from the donors. Gavin then turned and practically sprinted up the velvet-lined stairs to the main stage. Corinne was already there, her face a mask of practiced solemn grief. She handed Gavin a silver microphone. He tapped it once, the sound echoing through the massive speakers, demanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. He smoothed the lapels of his custom tuxedo, took a deep theatrical breath, and arranged his features into a portrait of a heartbroken, deeply burdened leader. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gavin began, his voice projecting a masterful blend of sorrow and authority, "I apologize for the disruption. I had hoped to keep this matter private to preserve the dignity of my family on a night meant for celebration. But as you have just witnessed, my wife is no longer in control of her actions." A collective murmur rippled through the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. I remained standing exactly where I was, my posture rigid, my chin held high. I let the microcamera hidden in the diamond pendant capture every syllable of his public perjury. For the past several months, Bethany has been suffering from a severe mental decline. Gavin continued, stepping closer to the edge of the stage, speaking directly to the wealthiest investors in the front row. Her behavior has become increasingly erratic, deeply paranoid, and aggressively unstable. I tried to get her the psychological help she so desperately needs. I stood by her, but unfortunately, her illness manifested in ways that compromised the absolute integrity of this firm. Corinne stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on Gavin's shoulder. It was a flawless, sickening performance. While operating under this profound mental distress, Bethany utilized her position as our chief accountant to initiate a series of unauthorized financial transfers. Gavin declared, his voice ringing with faux devastation. She engaged in severe financial mismanagement, attempting to siphon firm assets into hidden accounts. Fortunately, our internal security protocols flagged the discrepancies immediately. The firm's capital is secure and no client accounts were ever impacted. He was lying effortlessly to the exact people he had robbed. He was painting my fabricated mental breakdown as the sole cause of his $50 million theft, insulating his empire with my impending destruction. I cannot in good conscience allow her to remain tied to this historic institution, Gavin said, looking down at me with a gaze full of venomous triumph. Tonight, I am publicly announcing our divorce. Furthermore, my mother and I have drafted a comprehensive restitution and resignation agreement. Bethany is stepping down effective immediately, and while this breaks my heart, I am moving forward. I am starting a new stable life with a partner who understands the immense responsibility of the sterling legacy. He gestured vaguely toward the side door where Paige had been escorted, officially sanctioning his mistress in front of the city's elite. He then turned his full attention back to me. He picked up a heavy mahogany folder from the podium, opening it to display the restrictive non-disclosure agreement and the forged confession we had discussed outside the police precinct. "Bethany," Gavin said, holding out a silver fountain pen. "Come up here. Do the right thing. Sign the confession, make your amends to these good people, and step away with whatever dignity you have left." This was the trap. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the remaining 4 security guards subtly shift their weight, closing the distance between us. They were forming a physical perimeter. The moment the ink dried on that page, they were going to rush the stage, grab me by the arms, and drag me out through the service elevator before I could defend myself. Gavin had engineered the ultimate public execution. I did not flinch. I slowly began to walk toward the stage. The crowd parted for me instinctively. The power red silk of my custom gown flowed around my legs, a brilliant slash of color against the sterile, monochromatic wealth of the ballroom. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Gavin. I felt the tiny vibration against my chest. Agent Thorne and the Federal Tactical Team were tapped into the live feed. They were waiting in the service corridors, listening to Gavin confess to possessing the fraudulent documents, watching him attempt to extort a federal witness. I climbed the velvet-lined stairs, my stiletto heels clicking sharply against the polished wood of the stage. Corinne took a subtle step back, clearly unnerved by my absolute lack of tears. Gavin stood his ground, thrusting the silver pen toward my hand, pointing aggressively at the signature line on the fraudulent confession. I did not take the pen. Instead, I reached out and took the silver microphone directly from Gavin's hand. His smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second, his fingers tightening around the mahogany folder. He opened his mouth to call for the security guards, but I stepped smoothly in front of him, claiming the center of the stage. I looked out at the sea of 500 faces. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with electric anticipation. I reached into the hidden pocket of my gown and pulled out a small, sleek black remote control. "I am here to make amends," I announced to the crowd, my voice echoing with terrifying, unshakable clarity. "But first, let us look at what I am actually amending." I pressed the button. The massive digital screens flanking the grand stage instantly went black. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom as the sterling firm's gleaming 30th anniversary logo vanished. A fraction of a second later, the screens flared back to life, bathing Gavin and Corinne in a harsh, unforgiving blue light. They were no longer displaying congratulatory corporate videos. They were broadcasting high-resolution, unredacted offshore bank statements and internal routing ledgers. Gavin spun around. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked absolutely hollow. He lunged toward me, his hands grasping for the microphone, but I simply stepped out of his reach. The stilettos anchored me to the stage. I was entirely in my element now. For 5 years, my husband and my mother-in-law have relied on a very specific narrative, I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. They needed you to believe I was nothing more than a quiet, simple-minded accountant, lucky enough to marry into the Sterling dynasty. They relied on my silence. They relied on my perceived insignificance to hide what they were doing to every single person in this room. The crowd of 500 investors, politicians, and socialites stared up at the screens. These were people who understood money better than anyone on earth. It only took them a few seconds to recognize the format of the master ledgers. The hushed whispers turned into a rising tide of angry, confused murmurs. Let us examine this narrative of my supposed financial mismanagement. I continued gesturing to the massive screen on my left. A laser pointer beam materialized on the projection courtesy of Simone operating the controls from the back of the room. The red dot circled a specific line item dated exactly 8 months ago. I draw your attention to a $2 million expenditure listed as a consulting fee for emerging markets. I instructed, pacing the stage with the absolute authority of a lead prosecutor. If you trace the routing numbers displayed on the right side of the screen, you will see that this money never went to a consulting firm. It was wired directly through 3 shell companies based in the Cayman Islands. The final destination was a private real estate escrow account. I paused, letting my gaze sweep over the crowd until I found Paige. She was standing near the side exit, clutching her ruined hair, her soaked silver dress clinging to her trembling frame. The security guards holding her back were too stunned by the screens to move her outside. That exact sum paid in full for the luxury penthouse condo currently occupied by Gavin's mistress, I announced. Your retirement funds, your portfolio dividends, and your corporate investments bought Paige her breathtaking view of Central Park. A furious shout erupted from the front row. An elderly billionaire, one of Sterling's oldest and most loyal clients, stood up and pointed a shaking finger at Gavin. Gavin opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, breathless stammer came out. He was completely paralyzed by the exposure. But $2 million is just pocket change to the Sterling family, I said, raising my voice to cut through the mounting outrage of the crowd. I pressed the remote again. The screens transitioned to a new spreadsheet, this one detailing massive multi-million-dollar hemorrhages of capital. Observe this sequence of transactions labeled Overseas Expansion Initiatives, I directed. $5 million transferred last quarter, another $4 million the quarter before that. A total of nearly $30 million drained from your collective accounts over the last 3 years. While Corinne forced me to balance the legitimate books down to the very last penny to keep the auditors satisfied, she and Gavin were operating a shadow ledger right beneath my nose. I turned to look directly at Gavin. He was sweating profusely, his pristine tuxedo suddenly looking like a prison uniform. That $30 million did not build infrastructure in Europe, I stated, delivering the final crushing blow. It went directly to cover Gavin's catastrophic high-stakes gambling debts in Macau and Monaco. Every time he claimed to be on a vital international business trip, securing your financial futures, he was at the baccarat tables throwing away your life savings. And when the deficit became too massive to hide any longer, they decided to frame the working-class wife. They planted forged documents in my home to ensure I would take the fall when the federal indictments inevitably came. The ballroom exploded. 500 of the most powerful people in the city were suddenly screaming. Decades of pristine corporate reputation shattered in a matter of minutes. Investors were pulling out their phones, frantically dialing their personal attorneys and financial advisors. The polite elite gathering had instantly transformed into a furious mob demanding blood. Corinne finally snapped out of her state of profound shock. The mask of the dignified matriarch melted away, revealing the vicious, desperate tyrant underneath. Her face contorted with pure rage. "Turn it off!" Corinne shrieked, her voice tearing through the chaotic noise of the ballroom. She waved her arms frantically at the 6 plainclothes security guards stationed around the stage. I said, turn those screens off right now. Cut the main power. Get her off this stage. The security guards, jolted back to reality by their employer's screaming, immediately broke into a sprint. 4 of them charged down the center aisle, shoving past the furious billionaires, making a desperate dash for the enclosed AV control booth located at the very back of the ballroom. They hit the heavy wooden doors of the booth with their shoulders, expecting them to fly open. Instead, a loud, heavy thud echoed through the back of the hall. The doors did not budge a single inch. The guards slammed their weight against the wood again, kicking at the handles, but the doors were entirely immovable. They had been heavily barricaded from the inside. From the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains framing the main stage, a figure stepped out into the spotlight. Simone moved with lethal grace, wearing a sharp black suit. She walked directly up to the edge of the stage, looking down at the panicked security guards, and then shifting her cold gaze directly to Corinne. Simone raised her right hand. Dangling from her fingers was a thick metal ring, holding the heavy brass master keys to the hotel's entire electrical and security infrastructure. She tossed the keys into the air, caught them with a sharp jingle, and offered Corinne a fierce, unyielding smile. "The truth stays on screen, Corinne," Simone shouted, her voice easily projecting over the roar of the furious crowd. The crowd's roar shifted from sheer confusion to unadulterated outrage. Corinne stood entirely frozen, her manicured hands trembling as she stared at Simone. The imposing security guards were effectively neutralized, trapped outside the reinforced doors of the AV booth. Gavin, however, refused to surrender his empire without a fight. His survival instinct kicked in, fueled by a lifetime of unchecked privilege and absolute narcissism. He gripped the silver microphone, his knuckles turning white, and forced a booming, patronizing laugh that attempted to cut through the mounting chaos of the grand ballroom. "Please, everyone, I implore you to remain calm," Gavin ordered. He flashed his signature, heavily practiced corporate smile. It was the same smile he used to charm venture capitalists and pacify nervous board members. He paced the center of the stage, gesturing dismissively toward the towering digital screens that continued to broadcast his financial crimes in glowing high definition. "This is exactly the erratic, vindictive behavior I was trying to warn you about," Gavin announced, projecting an aura of deeply burdened patience. "What you are looking at on those screens is nothing more than a crude digital fabrication. It is a desperate, pathetic smear campaign. Bethany is a skilled accountant, yes. She possesses the technical knowledge to manipulate spreadsheets and manufacture false evidence. She is utilizing her professional skills to execute a personal vendetta because she simply cannot handle the fact that our marriage is over." He turned to the audience, holding his free hand over his heart, playing the ultimate victim. "She is unwell," Gavin pleaded, his voice dripping with fabricated sorrow. "She is lashing out at the firm, at my mother, and at all of you simply to punish me. I beg for your understanding during this incredibly difficult family crisis." A few of the older, loyal investors exchanged uncertain glances. Gavin had spent years cultivating a flawless reputation. His ability to lie with absolute conviction was his greatest asset. He was attempting to weaponize his charisma to gaslight 500 of the most powerful people in New York City. But the elderly billionaire in the front row was not easily swayed. He stepped forward, ignoring the protests of the surrounding security personnel. He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at Gavin's chest. He demanded a verifiable explanation for the offshore routing numbers. He demanded to know exactly where his capital was currently sitting. Gavin sensed the lingering, dangerous doubt spreading through the crowd. The polite murmurs were turning into hostile demands. His carefully constructed mask began to slip. The polished corporate executive vanished, replaced by the arrogant, vicious heir who had never been told no. His face flushed a dark mottled crimson. He whipped around to face me, his composure shattering entirely. "You are just a bitter, dumped housewife," Gavin yelled, the microphone amplifying his raw, unfiltered rage across the silent ballroom. "You honestly believe you can walk in here with fake spreadsheets and destroy a 30-year legacy? You think these people will take the word of a nobody over the Sterling family?" He took a threatening step toward the edge of the stage, his chest heaving. He was so consumed by his need to humiliate me that he completely abandoned his legal discipline. He needed to prove his absolute supremacy to the room. He needed to prove that he was untouchable. "My investors trust me," Gavin roared, sweeping his arm toward the wealthy crowd. "They know exactly how this firm operates, and they know I deliver results. Their money is completely secure. It is sitting safely in account 8804, entirely isolated in the Cayman Islands and fully protected by international banking law. You cannot touch it, Bethany. No one can." The silence that followed his outburst was deafening. It was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The elite crowd hung on his every word, their minds rapidly processing the arrogant confession he had just broadcasted to 500 witnesses. In his desperate, frantic attempt to assert dominance and reassure his investors, Gavin had made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. He had inadvertently verified the existence of the shadow accounts on a live microphone. He had spoken the exact account number out loud. Corinne realized his massive blunder a fraction of a second too late. She let out a strangled gasp, lunging forward to grab Gavin's arm, her fingernails digging into his custom tuxedo jacket. She tried to pull the microphone away from his mouth, but the damage was already permanently etched into the record. The hidden camera in my diamond pendant captured every single syllable. I stood perfectly still at the base of the stage, letting his words echo off the marble walls and crystal chandeliers. I felt the cool, heavy weight of the silk gown against my skin. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I had let him dig his own grave, and he had eagerly grabbed the shovel. I thought back to this darkest moment of my life. I remembered lying in a sterile, freezing hospital bed 3 years ago, exhausted and bleeding after a brutal emergency cesarean section. I remembered waking up to find Gavin standing over me, not with flowers or words of comfort, but with a team of corporate lawyers and a stack of highly complex legal documents. He had capitalized on my physical trauma and heavy medication, aggressively demanding I sign a post-nuptial agreement to protect his future assets. He had treated my near-death experience as a convenient business opportunity. He thought I had been too weak to read the fine print. He thought my working-class background meant I could not comprehend the dense, convoluted legalese hidden in the back pages of that contract. He had fundamentally underestimated me from the very beginning. I lifted my silver microphone, letting a chilling, triumphant smirk spread across my face. I looked directly into his panicked, cornered eyes, watching the sudden realization of his own foolishness wash over him. "You are right, Gavin," I said, my voice echoing with absolute, unwavering finality. "I cannot touch it. But the federal government can. Did you really think I did not read the post-nup you forced me to sign in the hospital?" Gavin stared at me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The color drained completely from his face as the reality of my words collided with his arrogant assumptions. He looked toward the barricaded doors, then back at me, his breathing ragged and shallow. "The post-nuptial agreement." I projected my voice clearly across the room, ensuring every investor, every board member, and every socialite heard the precise legal mechanics of his downfall. "You drafted it to ensure I could never touch your precious sterling family wealth if we divorced. You rushed it in front of me while I was recovering from surgery, banking on my exhaustion. But you forgot one crucial detail, Gavin. I am a forensic accountant. I read every single clause." I took a slow, deliberate step closer to him. He practically stumbled backward. "By forcing me to sign that document, you legally severed all my financial liability from your assets," I explained, scanning the front rows of horrified donors. "You officially documented that I had absolutely zero oversight, control, or access to your private accounts. You completely indemnified me from your crimes." Corinne let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She finally understood the trap they had built for themselves. She grabbed Gavin's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his sleeve, but he shook her off, his eyes wild with panic. "You think a piece of paper saves you?" Gavin shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You are still implicated. You are the chief accountant of this firm." "I was," I countered smoothly, "until I realized exactly what you and your mother were hiding. That is when I made a career change." I reached into the hidden pocket of my silk gown and pulled out a heavy embossed silver badge attached to a leather credential case. I held it up high for the entire ballroom to see. The glare of the stage lights caught the official government seal. "I haven't been unemployed for the last 6 months," I announced, letting the sheer weight of the statement settle over the silent crowd. "I have been fully employed by the federal government. I am a registered federal whistleblower for the Internal Revenue Service." A shockwave tore through the room. Several high-profile politicians in the second row instantly stood up and began backing away toward the emergency exits, desperate to distance themselves from the blast radius of a federal investigation. "The moment you insulated me with that post-nup, you gave the IRS the green light to strike," I continued, my voice unyielding. "They could finally move on your assets without freezing my innocent accounts. Every time you left for a supposed business trip, I was sitting in a secure briefing room, turning over your ledgers, your encrypted hard drives, and your forged tax returns." Gavin shook his head frantically. Sweat dripped down his forehead, ruining his perfectly styled hair. He looked like a trapped animal. "No," he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "No, you don't have the jurisdiction. Account 8804 is untouchable. The Cayman authorities do not cooperate with American tax probes. My money is safe." "Your money is evidence," I shot back. "And they do cooperate when the charges are not just tax evasion. I didn't just hand over a few mismatched receipts, Gavin. I have been building a massive airtight RICO case against you and your mother. Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Wire fraud, money laundering, extortion, and the systemic embezzlement of over $30 million. I looked over at Corinne. She was trembling violently, her face the color of ash. She opened her mouth to speak, to issue another command, but her voice completely failed her. The undisputed queen of the Sterling Empire had finally been dethroned. Gavin suddenly threw his head back and let out a loud, jarring laugh. It was a hysterical, manic sound that echoed horribly in the tense ballroom. He clapped his hands slowly, a desperate attempt to regain control of a narrative that had already burned to the ground. "You are bluffing!" Gavin yelled, his face twisting into a sneer. "You are putting on a great show, Bethany, but I know how the system works. I am a lawyer. It takes months, sometimes years, to get a federal warrant for international accounts of that magnitude. You cannot just snap your fingers and bring down my firm. You are lying." "I don't need to snap my fingers," I replied softly, offering him a final icy smile. "I just needed to keep you talking on a live microphone long enough for you to publicly confess." At that exact second, a thunderous crash shook the foundations of the ballroom. The massive, solid oak double doors at the main entrance did not just open. They were violently breached. Wood splintered and hinges shrieked as the doors flew inward, slamming heavily against the marble walls. Dozens of tactical agents poured into the room like a tidal wave. They moved with terrifying, coordinated precision. They wore dark windbreakers with massive yellow letters spelling out FBI and IRSCI across their backs. Heavy boots pounded against the polished floor as they instantly fanned out, securing every exit, every aisle, and every perimeter. "Federal agents, nobody move!" A commanding voice boomed over a bullhorn, cutting through the sudden screams of the terrified elite. Gavin froze. His microphone dropped from his hand, hitting the wooden stage with a sharp screech of feedback. The hysterical laughter died in his throat, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He stared at the swarm of federal agents rushing down the center aisle directly toward the stage, their badges flashing under the crystal chandeliers. The heavy thud of tactical boots against the polished marble floor drowned out the screams of the city's most powerful elites. Dozens of federal agents flooded the grand ballroom, forming an impenetrable perimeter of dark windbreakers and tactical gear. The blinding stage lights reflected off the silver badges of the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit, a terrifying confirmation that my threats were not empty words. The Sterling firm's 30th anniversary gala had officially transformed into a federal crime scene. Gavin remained paralyzed on the stage, his hands hovering awkwardly in the air as if he had forgotten how to control his own body. Two agents charged up the velvet-lined stairs, barking commands that echoed through the cavernous space. They grabbed Gavin by his custom-tailored shoulders, spinning him around and forcing his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists cut through the residual noise of the crowd. Corinne collapsed into a nearby chair, clutching her chest, as a female agent began reading her Miranda rights. I stood my ground at the base of the stage, breathing in the chaotic, glorious reality of my completed mission. But the reckoning was not quite finished. My gaze shifted across the room, cutting through the sea of panicked billionaires and terrified politicians until I found Paige. She was pinned against the far wall near the catering exit, looking like a drowned rat. Her silver designer gown was still soaked from the champagne clinging to her trembling body. Her perfect blowout was a stringy mess, and dark streaks of mascara ran down her pale cheeks. She was staring up at the massive projection screens, her eyes darting frantically across the offshore banking ledgers and the highlighted routing numbers that traced millions of dollars directly into her name. The reality of the situation was crashing down on her in real time. The luxurious, untouchable lifestyle Gavin had promised her was a complete fabrication. He was not a billionaire titan of industry. He was a broke, desperate criminal, and he had just used stolen capital to buy her a penthouse. She was holding the bag. Paige snapped her gaze away from the screens and locked eyes with Gavin as he was being marched down the stage stairs by the federal agents. The sheer panic in her face morphed instantly into pure, unadulterated rage. She shoved her way past a cluster of stunned socialites, ignoring the federal agents securing the perimeter. She marched right up to the edge of the police line forming around Gavin, her voice tearing through the ambient noise of the ballroom. "You said you had billions!" Paige screamed, her face contorted with fury. She pointed a shaking finger directly at Gavin's face. "You told me the firm was untouchable. You are a fraud. You lied to me about everything, and I am not going to jail for you." Gavin tried to respond, but an agent shoved him forward, ignoring the furious mistress entirely. Paige watched him get dragged away, her chest heaving. She looked down at her left hand. Resting on her ring finger was the massive, flawless 5-carat diamond Gavin had given her just weeks ago. A ring he had proudly boasted cost more than most people make in a decade. Suddenly, that ring was no longer a symbol of status or an entry ticket into high society. It was a neon flashing sign. It was physical evidence of federal wire fraud sitting right on her hand. Paige grabbed the diamond, her wet, shaking fingers struggling to yank it over her knuckle. She let out a frustrated sob, pulling harder until the heavy ring finally popped off her finger. She glanced around frantically, her eyes darting left and right to see if any of the federal agents were watching her. Seeing the authorities focused on securing the wealthy investors, Paige dropped the 5-carat diamond onto the marble floor. She gave it a swift, desperate kick, sending the multi-million-dollar piece of evidence skittering beneath a long table draped in heavy white linen. She then hunched her shoulders, attempting to make herself as small as possible. She grabbed a discarded suit jacket off the back of a nearby chair, wrapping it over her ruined silver gown to hide her distinctive outfit. She kept her head down, weaving her way through a dense crowd of terrified guests who were being slowly herded toward the main exit for questioning. She was making a beeline for the service hallway, clearly intending to slip out through the kitchen loading dock and vanish into the Manhattan night. I watched her maneuver through the crowd. I simply reached up and tapped the small earpiece hidden beneath my hair. Paige reached the heavy swinging doors of the service exit. She pushed her weight against the wood, a relieved gasp escaping her lips as the door gave way. She took one step into the dimly lit hallway and instantly slammed into a solid wall of dark fabric. A tall, imposing man in an FBI windbreaker stood squarely in the center of the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked down at Paige with a calm, analytical expression. Paige gasped, stumbling backward into the ballroom. She tried to pivot and run in the opposite direction, but the agent reached out his hand, clamping down on her arm with an iron grip. I walked smoothly across the marble floor, the crowd parting for me as I approached the service exit. I stopped right next to the agent, offering Paige a serene, polite smile. "Going somewhere so soon, Paige?" I asked. "The party is just getting started." Paige stared at me, her eyes wide with terror before looking up at the man holding her arm. "You remember Marcus?" I said, gesturing to the tall agent. "For the last 6 months you knew him as my senior manager at the accounting firm, the one who supposedly kept passing me over for promotions." Marcus reached into his jacket pocket with his free hand. He pulled out a clear plastic evidence bag. Resting inside the bag was the massive 5-carat diamond ring Paige had just kicked under the table. "Actually, ma'am," Marcus said, his voice deep and entirely devoid of amusement, "that ring was purchased with stolen federal funds. You are coming with us for receipt of stolen property." Marcus secured the zip ties around Paige's wrists, her sobs drowning in the deafening commotion of the ballroom. The sight of the mistress being hauled away like a common thief sent a fresh wave of panic through the Sterling firm's remaining executives. But my focus immediately snapped back to the center of the stage. The lead tactical agent had reached Gavin, securing the handcuffs with a definitive metallic click. The golden boy of New York finance was now weeping openly, his knees buckling as reality crushed him. Corinne stood inches away from her son. She watched the steel cuffs lock around Gavin's wrists, and in that split second her maternal instincts completely evaporated. Corinne was a survivor above all else. She had clawed her way to the top of the social registry, ruthlessly eliminating anyone who threatened her status. Now staring down the barrel of federal prison and the total liquidation of her assets, she calculated her only remaining exit strategy. She needed a scapegoat, and the perfect candidate was sobbing right beside her. Corinne violently ripped her arm away from Gavin when he leaned toward her for comfort. She smoothed her custom silk gown, lifted her chin, and arranged her features into a mask of pure victimized horror. "Officers, you must listen to me," Corinne declared, her voice ringing out with practiced theatrical authority. She marched directly toward the lead FBI agent, pointing a manicured finger at her own flesh and blood. "I had absolutely no knowledge of these transactions. Gavin handled all international accounts. He kept the ledgers entirely isolated from my desk." Gavin jerked his head up, the tears streaming down his flushed face, freezing in place. He stared at his mother in absolute disbelief. "Mom," Gavin choked out, his voice cracking. "What are you doing? Do not speak to me." Corinne snapped, her eyes flashing with venomous survival instinct. She turned her full attention back to the federal agents, raising her voice so the surrounding investors and society reporters could hear her flawless perjury. "He was always a disappointment," Corinne shrieked, abandoning her golden boy instantly. "I trusted him to uphold the sterling legacy of this firm, and he corrupted it behind my back. He stole from these good people to feed his disgusting gambling addiction. Arrest him. Take him away. I am innocent." A collective gasp swept through the remaining crowd. Even the hardened federal agents paused for a fraction of a second, stunned by the sheer ice-cold brutality of a mother serving her son to the wolves to save her own skin. Gavin crumpled, sobbing harder, as the ultimate betrayal broke him completely. He had spent his entire life molding himself into Corinne's perfect weapon, and the moment he became a liability, she discarded him like trash. Corinne stood tall, adjusting her diamond necklace. She believed she had won. She believed her aggressive pivot had secured her innocence in the eyes of the law and the elite spectators. Then the rhythmic clicking of heels echoed against the marble floor. Simone walked slowly down the center aisle, having descended from the barricaded AV booth. She bypassed the frantic donors and the federal perimeter, stopping right at the edge of the stage. She held her smartphone casually in her right hand. The master AV control cable she had ripped from the booth trailed from the bottom of the device, directly hardwired into the ballroom's massive primary sound system. Simone looked up at Corinne. The smile on Simone's face was sharp, predatory, and completely unforgiving. "You really think you can talk your way out of a RICO indictment, Corinne?" Simone asked, her voice carrying effortlessly. "You forget who set up your secure communication networks." Corinne's arrogant posture faltered. "Arrest that woman," Corinne demanded, gesturing wildly at Simone. "She is a rogue employee assisting in this ridiculous smear campaign." Simone did not blink. She simply stepped up to the federal agents standing between her and Corinne. "I think the agents would prefer to hear Exhibit A," Simone said. She pressed play on her phone screen. For a brief second, there was a hiss of static. Then, clear as day, Corinne's sharp, unmistakable voice rang out over the massive ballroom speakers, vibrating through the floorboards and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Move the $10 million from the pension fund to the Caymans immediately." The recorded voice of Corinne ordered, her tone dripping with malicious calculation. Do not leave a paper trail on the domestic side. Gavin handled the routing protocols exactly as we discussed. If that ghetto accountant Bethany finds out about the transfer, do not panic. We will just have her declared insane. The firm's psychiatrist is already on the payroll. The audio recording clicked off, leaving an earth-shattering silence in its wake. The undeniable proof of her guilt, her direct orchestration of the embezzlement, and her vile plot to destroy my sanity hung in the air. The investors who had just witnessed her attempt to sacrifice her son now stared at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. Corinne backed away from the edge of the stage, her mouth opening in a silent scream. She looked at the federal agents closing in on her with handcuffs ready. She looked at Gavin, who was staring at her with hollow, broken eyes. Finally, she looked at me, standing tall and utterly victorious at the base of the stairs. The realization that her elite status, her wealth, and her freedom were permanently eradicated hit her all at once. Corinne's legs gave out. She collapsed to her knees, the heavy silk of her designer gown pooling around her on the hard wooden stage as the federal agents moved in to make the arrest. The cold steel of federal handcuffs snapping around Corinne Sterling's wrists sounded like a gunshot in the chaotic ballroom. The formidable matriarch who had spent decades dictating the social hierarchy of Manhattan was unceremoniously hauled to her feet by a female IRS agent. Her knees, weakened by shock and the sheer weight of her impending ruin, refused to support her. Two agents had to bear her weight, gripping her firmly under the arms as they dragged her toward the center aisle. Corinne did not fight. The sheer indignity of being paraded past her peers, the very people she had terrorized, manipulated, and controlled for 30 years, stripped away her final ounce of defiance. She stared at the marble floor, her expensive makeup ruined by tears of absolute defeat. She passed the elderly billionaire in the front row, the man who had demanded answers moments earlier. He leaned forward and spat an insult at her feet. Corinne flinched, but kept her eyes cast downward, a broken queen taking her final humiliating walk of shame out of the empire she had built on lies. Across the room near the service exit, Paige was faring much worse. Marcus, the undercover FBI agent she had foolishly dismissed as a middle management drone, spun her around and pinned her arms behind her back. Paige thrashed violently, her soaked silver gown tearing at the seam. She shrieked, kicking her heels against the wooden baseboards, desperately pleading with anyone who would listen that she was just an innocent girlfriend. She pointed a frantic manicured finger toward the stage, screaming that Gavin had manipulated her, that she knew absolutely nothing about the routing numbers blazing across the massive digital screens. Marcus ignored her tantrums, efficiently securing the heavy zip ties around her wrists. He informed her in a steady, unyielding tone that ignorance was not a defense against federal wire fraud and the receipt of millions in stolen property. Her high-pitched wails echoed against the vaulted ceiling as another agent took custody of her, marching her forcefully toward the service elevators. She wept bitterly for her lost penthouse, her seized bank accounts, and the terrifying reality of a federal holding cell. But it was Gavin who refused to accept his new reality. As two tactical agents clamped their hands down on his shoulders, the polished corporate titan completely evaporated. He violently twisted his torso, attempting to shake off the federal officers. It was a pathetic, futile struggle. The agents tightened their grip, driving his chest down onto the polished wooden stage. Gavin gasped. The wind knocked out of his lungs, but his arrogance remained entirely intact. He thrashed against the floorboards, his custom tuxedo jacket ripping at the shoulder. He tilted his head up his face, a mottled crimson mask of fury, and locked eyes with me. He did not look like a man facing decades in federal prison. He looked like a spoiled heir who had just been denied his favorite toy. "Get your hands off me!" Gavin roared. Spit flying from his lips as the agents hauled him back to his feet and slammed him against the podium to properly secure his wrists. "Do you have any idea who I am? I am a Sterling. My lawyers will have me out of holding before you even finish processing the paperwork." I stood my ground at the base of the stage, my arms crossed, watching the pathetic display. The investors in the front rows, the people whose money Gavin had brazenly stolen, watched him with unfiltered disgust. They were already dialing their own legal teams, preparing to carve up the remains of the Sterling firm. They watched the golden boy of New York finance reduce himself to a screaming, petulant child. "You are nothing!" Gavin yelled at me, straining against the heavy metal cuffs biting into his wrists. "You are a bitter, dumped housewife playing cop. You think a flashy entrance changes how this city operates? Money buys freedom, Bethany, and I have enough capital buried in trusts you will never find to buy my way out of this." I let him rant. I let him showcase his complete lack of remorse to the very agents building his prosecution profile. He was digging his grave deeper with every single syllable. "I still have the best judges in this state on my payroll." Gavin spat, his voice dropping into a vicious guttural snarl that carried perfectly across the quiet room. "I will be out on bail in an hour, and the second I am, I will destroy you. I will bury you in so much litigation you will never see the light of day." He smiled, a feral, desperate smile clinging to the illusion of his untouchable status. He truly believed the corrupted state system he had exploited for years would rise up to protect him. Simone stepped forward. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, stopping right next to me at the base of the stage. She looked up at Gavin, her expression a masterclass in professional condescension. She did not raise her voice. She simply dismantled his entire defense with surgical precision. "Actually, Gavin," Simone stated, her tone light and conversational, "state judges cannot help you with federal indictments. Since these are federal charges encompassing international money laundering, wire fraud, and racketeering, you are facing a federal magistrate." Gavin stopped struggling. A new, deeper layer of panic washed over his flushed face. He recognized Simone from the accounting firm, but he was finally realizing she was never just an IT specialist. "Specifically," Simone continued, offering him a bright, razor-sharp smile, "you will be standing in front of Federal Judge Harrison." The name hit Gavin like a physical blow. His jaw went slack, and the remaining color drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. "Yes, that Judge Harrison." Simone nodded, thoroughly enjoying the moment. "The one you aggressively tried to bribe last year to rule in favor of your offshore zoning permits. The one who despises you and everything your firm represents. I know this because I forwarded him the unredacted receipts, the wire transfer attempts, and your private email logs at 6 o'clock this morning." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a low, authoritative whisper. "Judge Harrison personally signed your arrest warrant, Gavin. Given your established flight risk, your access to offshore capital, and your documented history of attempting to corrupt the judicial process, bail is going to be definitively denied." Simone tilted her head, her smile fading into a look of absolute finality. "Enjoy prison." The morning sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the federal building in Lower Manhattan, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished mahogany conference table. The silence in the room was a stark contrast to the absolute chaos of the previous night. On the far wall, a large, flat-screen television played the local news on a silent loop, but the scrolling ticker tape at the bottom of the screen told the entire story. The Sterling financial empire had completely collapsed. I sat back in my leather chair, a steaming cup of coffee resting in my hands, and watched the broadcast. The news channels were running a continuous loop of the arrests. There was Corinne, stripped of her pristine composure, desperately trying to cover her face with the torn fabric of her custom silk gown, as agents shoved her into the back of a black SUV. There was Paige, mascara smeared down her cheeks, screaming obscenities at the flashing cameras while struggling against her zip ties. And then there was Gavin. The golden boy of New York finance looked entirely hollowed out. His custom tuxedo was rumpled, his hair was a mess, and his eyes were wide with the terrified realization that his money could no longer save him. My attorney, David, sat across from me. He tapped a thick stack of legal documents against the table to straighten them, pulling my attention away from the television. "The federal magistrate denied bail for all three of them at 5 o'clock this morning," David announced, sliding a silver pen across the table toward me. "Given the flight risk and the sheer scale of the offshore accounts you handed over, Judge Harrison ordered them remanded to federal custody pending trial." Gavin's high-priced defense team abandoned ship the second they realized the Department of Justice had frozen every single asset tied to the Sterling name. He is completely broke. I picked up the pen, feeling the cool metal against my skin. And the criminal charges: wire fraud, extortion, racketeering, and tax evasion. David listed, a deeply satisfied smile spreading across his face. The U.S. Attorney's Office is not offering any plea deals. With the mountain of encrypted ledgers and recorded confessions you provided, Gavin is facing a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Corinne is looking at the exact same sentence. David slid the top document toward me. It was the final divorce decree. The post-nuptial agreement Gavin had forced upon me while I was bleeding in a hospital bed had proven to be the ultimate weapon. Because he had legally severed our liabilities, I walked away completely untouched by the federal asset seizure. I signed my name on the dotted line, officially dissolving the marriage that had nearly destroyed me. Now for the most important part, David said, sliding the second stack of papers forward. I looked down at the custody agreement. For months, Gavin and Corinne had threatened to use their immense wealth and judicial connections to take my daughter Lily away from me. They had promised to drag my name through the mud, to paint me as an unfit, unstable mother, and to leave me with nothing but supervised weekend visits. That threat was now dead and buried. With Gavin facing 2 decades in federal prison and his mother locked in a cell beside him, there is no one left to contest this, David explained, tapping the signature line. The state has granted you sole, uncontested physical and legal custody of Lily. Gavin's parental rights are effectively suspended indefinitely. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name. A massive, suffocating weight lifted off my chest. The constant gnawing fear that Corinne would poison my daughter's mind, or that Gavin would use her as a pawn, was finally gone. Lily was safe. She was entirely mine. The heavy glass door of the conference room swung open. Marcus strode in, followed closely by Simone. They both looked exhausted from a long night of processing high-profile suspects, but they carried an undeniable aura of victory. Simone was no longer wearing the oversized cardigan she used at the accounting firm to blend into the background. She wore a sharp, dark suit, her federal badge clipped visibly to her belt. "The initial sweep of the Cayman accounts is complete," Marcus stated, taking a seat at the table. "You were right on the money, Bethany. We successfully recovered the entire $50 million they embezzled from the pension funds. The capital is currently being routed back to the United States Treasury to be redistributed to the victims." "Good," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "Those investors deserve their livelihoods back." "They do," Marcus agreed. He reached inside his jacket pocket. "But the federal government also recognizes the individuals who make that recovery possible, the people who take the massive risks to expose systemic corruption." He pulled out a thick official government envelope bearing the seal of the Internal Revenue Service. He placed it carefully on the glass table and slid it across to me. "Under the strict guidelines of the IRS whistleblower program," Marcus explained, his voice echoing with absolute authority, "informants who provide actionable intelligence resulting in the successful recovery of stolen assets are legally entitled to a reward. The mandatory payout ranges from 15 to 30% of the total recovered funds." I stared at the envelope, my heart giving a sudden sharp thud against my ribs. I had initiated this operation to save my daughter and secure my freedom. I had spent 6 months playing a dangerous game of corporate espionage just to survive. "Because your forensic accounting work was so flawless, and because you single-handedly delivered a $50 million recovery on a silver platter," Simone added, a triumphant grin breaking across her face. "The director of the IRS approved the lower end of the bracket, but it is still a monumental figure." I reached out and broke the seal on the envelope. I pulled out a heavy watermarked document. Attached to the front was a certified federal check bearing my exact legal name. I stared at the numbers printed across the center: $7,500,000. "That check is entirely tax-free," Marcus stated, watching the realization wash over my face. "You earned every single cent of it, Bethany." I looked down at the staggering figure. Just a few months ago, I was a discarded, humiliated housewife whose husband had frozen her bank accounts to force her into submission. Gavin had looked down on me because I came from a working-class family. He believed my lack of a trust fund made me weak, disposable, and easily manipulated. He thought he could strip away my dignity and leave me destitute. Instead, I had dismantled his entire legacy, secured absolute freedom for my daughter, and walked away with a massive fortune. I was officially a multi-millionaire. I carefully folded the check and slid it into my purse. I stood up, smoothing the front of my jacket, and looked out the window at the sprawling Manhattan skyline. The city that Gavin Sterling used to claim he owned now belonged to me. I turned to David, Marcus, and Simone, offering them a bright, unburdened smile. "If you will excuse me," I said, walking confidently toward the door. "I need to go pick up my daughter. We have a new house to buy." The harsh clatter of a plastic bucket echoing against cinderblock walls replaced the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. Exactly 1 year had passed since the FBI raided the Sterling Gala, and the absolute destruction of their elite dynasty was complete. Gavin Sterling, the former golden boy of Manhattan finance, plunged a gray mop into murky, bleach-scented water. He wore a shapeless, oversized orange jumpsuit that swallowed his previously tailored frame. The unforgiving fluorescent lights of the federal penitentiary illuminated the deep, exhausted lines etched into his face. There were no offshore accounts to save him, no bribed judges to grant him leniency, and no high-priced lawyers returning his calls. He had 20 long years ahead of him, and his current reality consisted of scrubbing the communal cell block toilets while heavily armed guards barked orders at him. Every ounce of his arrogance had been systematically crushed under the weight of the federal justice system. 300 miles away, the matriarch of the fallen empire was adjusting to her own permanent nightmare. Corinne Sterling was serving her mandatory sentence in a minimum security facility in Danbury. She was entirely stripped of the extravagant luxury that had defined her entire existence. Her custom silk gowns were replaced by standard-issue khaki uniforms. The expensive blonde highlights she had maintained for decades had grown out, revealing stark, wiry gray roots. Without her wealth, her elite social registry status, and her curated power, Corinne was absolutely nobody. She sat in the noisy, crowded cafeteria, forced to eat heavily processed food, on a plastic tray surrounded by women who did not care about her sterling legacy. When she instinctively tried to order a younger inmate to clear her tray, the woman simply laughed in her face and walked away. Corinne was powerless, forgotten, and entirely alone. Paige had fared slightly differently, though her punishment was equally fitting. Terrified by the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence, she had quickly turned state's evidence, accepting a restrictive plea deal in exchange for her full cooperation. She avoided a cell, but she did not avoid the crushing financial restitution ordered by the court. Her luxury penthouse, her designer handbags, and her stolen jewelry had all been seized and liquidated by the IRS. Now she stood under the flickering neon lights of a fast food drive-thru in a bleak suburban strip mall. The heavy scent of stale cooking grease clung to her polyester uniform. A crackling plastic headset rested over her ear as she handed a greasy paper bag out the drive-thru window to an impatient customer. A massive percentage of her minimum wage paycheck was automatically garnished every 2 weeks to pay back the millions she had helped siphon. Her dream of marrying into limitless wealth had officially ended at a deep fryer. While the architects of my suffering paid for their crimes, I was busy building an empire of my own. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of a sprawling high-rise office building in downtown Chicago. The panoramic view of the city skyline was breathtaking, but it was the frosted glass doors at the entrance of the suite that I loved the most. The bold black lettering across the glass read Justice Forensics and Law Partners, Bethany and Simone. I stood at the edge of the massive mahogany conference table reviewing a thick stack of financial disclosures. Simone sat across from me, her fingers flying rapidly across her dual-monitor setup. We had taken the $7.5 million from my IRS whistleblower reward and transformed it into a specialized elite firm. We did not handle corporate mergers or standard tax audits. We had one specific, unwavering mission. We only took cases helping women escape financial abuse from toxic, manipulative spouses. I broke through his secondary firewall, Simone announced, a sharp, triumphant smile spreading across her face. She tapped the enter key with a definitive strike. Our client's husband thought he was being clever by routing his hidden assets through a shell corporation in the Bahamas. He used a nested LLC structure to hide the paper trail. Let me guess, I replied, leaning over her shoulder to look at the scrolling data. He left the digital signature exposed on the initial transfer. Exactly, Simone confirmed, printing the heavily encrypted ledgers. He is hiding $4 million that rightfully belongs to our client. I have the raw routing numbers, the IP addresses, and the offshore account manifests. We have him completely boxed in. Draft the asset freeze request immediately, I instructed, gathering the printed documents. We will serve his legal team this afternoon. By tomorrow morning, his accounts will be entirely locked down, and our client will finally have the leverage she needs to walk away with her children. I smiled, feeling a profound, undeniable sense of purpose. We were dismantling financial abusers one by one, using the exact same aggressive, unapologetic tactics we had used to take down Gavin. We gave powerless women the ultimate weapon to fight back. I walked away from the conference table and moved toward the bright, colorful play area we had built into the corner of my spacious corner office. Lily was sitting on a plush rug, happily building a massive tower out of wooden blocks. She was a thriving, joyful toddler, completely shielded from the darkness her father had tried to drag us into. She had a safe home, a fiercely protective mother, and a future entirely funded by the very money Gavin had tried to steal. I reached down and scooped Lily up into my arms. She giggled, wrapping her small arms around my neck. I held her close, walking over to the massive glass window to look out over the sprawling, vibrant city of Chicago. The sun warmed my face, and the chaotic noise of the streets below was muffled by the thick glass. I stood tall, feeling the absolute certainty of my victory. I turned away from the window, looking directly forward, holding my daughter securely against my chest. They say the best revenge is living well, I stated, my voice steady, victorious, and completely unburdened. But honestly, the best revenge is living well, getting rich, and letting the trash take itself out. Never let them tell you you are nothing. The most powerful lesson from Bethany's journey is that true vindication doesn't merely come from the downfall of your abusers, but from the reclaiming of your own power and purpose. While seeing Gavin and Corinne face federal consequences provided necessary justice, Bethany's real victory was building a thriving life and a firm dedicated to protecting other vulnerable women. True revenge is transforming your deepest trauma into untouchable strength, gaining financial independence, and simply leaving the toxicity behind to let the trash take itself out. Share one boundary you have set to protect your own peace and leave a comment below.